Welcome to NightSleepWhisper. As the world outside grows quiet, we travel back to the golden age of the pharaohs. Tonight, I will share with you a journey of shadows and light, a 50-part odyssey through the mysteries of the great temple and the silence of the desert. For now, simply breathe. Let go of the day's weight. As my voice guides you through the archives of the past, allow yourself to drift into a deep and restful sleep. The serpent and the sun are waiting. Rest well. The sun rose over the great city of Thebes. It was a bright, hot morning. Kamos opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling of his small house. He was a scribe, a man who wrote important things on papyrus. He lived alone in a house near the great temple. Kamos liked his life. He was a man of 30 years. He was tall, and he had dark, clever eyes that saw many things. He stood up and washed his face with cool water from a clay jar. He put on his clean white linen kilt and tied a simple leather belt around his waist. He picked up his wooden palette. It held his reed pens and 2 cakes of ink, one black and one red. He also took a new roll of fresh papyrus. Today was an important day. He had to record the temple's gold for the high priest. Kamos walked outside. The streets of Thebes were already busy. Men carried heavy baskets of grain on their shoulders. Women walked toward the river with clay water jars on their heads. Every adult in the city had a job to do. Kamos walked quickly through the crowd. He liked the smell of the city in the morning. He smelled fresh bread from the bakeries and the salty water of the Nile River. The great temple was a giant building made of heavy yellow stone. Huge statues of the pharaoh stood at the entrance. Their stone eyes looked out over the desert. Kamos walked past the tall, thick pillars. The air inside the temple was much cooler than the air outside. It smelled of heavy incense and old dust. Usually, the temple was a place of many voices. Priests chanted long prayers, and workers moved large stone blocks. But today, the great temple was very quiet. Kamos went to the Hall of Records. He sat at his small wooden desk and prepared his pens. He waited for the high priest, a man named Amunha. Amunha was an old man, but he was very strict. He was always at the temple before the sun was high in the sky. Kamos looked at the large bronze clock. The high priest was late. This was very strange. Kamos felt a small spark of worry in his chest. He stood up and walked toward the high priest's private office. The door was made of heavy, dark wood from a distant land. Kamos stopped in front of it. He reached out and hit the wood with his hand. The sound of his knocking was loud in the empty hallway. He waited for a voice to tell him to come inside. No one spoke. He knocked again, harder this time. Still, there was only silence. Kamos pushed the door slowly. It moved with a long, low sound of wood rubbing against the stone floor. The room inside was dark because the heavy curtains were closed. Kamos stepped into the room. He saw the high priest sitting at his large desk. The old man's head was down on the wood. He looked like he was sleeping, but his body was very still. Kamos walked closer. He reached out to touch the priest's shoulder, but the skin was cold. Kamos pulled his hand back quickly. His fingers felt cold from the touch. He looked at the high priest. Amunha. The old man did not move. His face was resting on the hard wood of the desk. One of his arms hung down toward the floor. His fingers were stiff and pale. Kamos felt a sharp chill in his own body, even though the room was warm. Lord Amunha. Kamos whispered. His voice was small in the large room. He waited for a reply, but there was only silence. He leaned closer to the priest's face. He looked for the movement of breath, but the priest's chest was still. The old man's eyes were half open. They looked at nothing. Kamos knew then that the high priest was dead. Kamos stood still for a long time. He did not know what to do first. He was just a scribe, a man of words and ink. He was not a man of death. He looked around the private office. It was a beautiful room. The walls were covered in bright paintings of the gods. There was a large statue of Anubis, the god of the dead, in the corner. The statue's black stone eyes seemed to watch Kamos. The room was very neat. But something felt wrong. Kamos looked at the large desk. There was a heavy gold cup on the floor near the priest's hanging hand. It was empty. A small wet spot marked the rug near the cup. Kamos bent down to look at it. The liquid was gone, but the rug had a strange, dark stain. He did not touch it. He remembered the smell of the room. It smelled of expensive incense. But there was another smell, too. It was sharp and bitter, like a crushed leaf from a desert plant. Kamos looked at the priest's hands again. Amunha always wore a heavy gold ring. It was the signet ring of the temple. It had the image of a hawk carved into a red stone. The priest used it to lock the temple's most important boxes. But now, the priest's fingers were bare. The ring was not there. Kamos searched the top of the desk. He looked under the papyrus scrolls and behind the ink jars. The ring was gone. The silence of the temple felt heavy now. Kamos heard the distant sound of a heavy door closing somewhere in the hallway. It was a slow, deep sound that echoed against the stone walls. He felt a sudden fear. If the high priest was dead, and his ring was gone, someone had taken it. Someone might still be nearby. Kamos knew he could not stay here alone. He needed someone who understood the body. He needed a healer. He thought of Merit. She was a wise woman who worked at the House of Life. She knew about medicines and she knew about death. Kamos turned and walked toward the door. He moved quietly, his leather sandals making no noise on the stone. He took one last look at the silent priest and then stepped out into the bright light of the hallway. He had to find Merit before anyone else found the body. Kamos walked quickly through the long stone halls. He did not run because he did not want the other priests to see his fear. He reached the House of Life, a large building next to the temple. This was where the healers lived and worked. The air here smelled of dried herbs, honey, and clean linen. He found Merit in a small room. She was an adult woman with a kind face and strong hands. She was busy grinding a green leaf into a paste. She looked up when Kamos entered. Her dark eyes were calm. She saw the sweat on his face and the way his hands shook. "Kamos," she said. Her voice was steady. "You look like you have seen a ghost. Sit down and drink some water." Kamos shook his head. "There is no time for water. Merit, please, come with me to the high priest's office. Something is very wrong. He does not wake up." Merit did not ask more questions. She took a small bag of tools and followed him. They walked through the temple in silence. When they reached the heavy wooden door, Kamos looked around to make sure the hallway was empty. He pushed the door open and they stepped inside. The room was still dark and silent. The high priest was in the same position. His head was still resting on the desk. Merit walked to the body without hesitation. She was a professional. She touched the priest's neck with 2 fingers. She waited for a long time. Then, she placed her hand over his mouth and nose. She felt for the movement of air. "He is dead. Kamos," she said softly. "His heart is silent. His breath is gone." Kamos felt a heavy weight in his stomach. Was it his heart? He was an old man. Merit did not answer yet. She picked up the priest's hand. She looked at his fingernails. They were a strange, dark blue color. Then she leaned down and smelled the priest's lips. She stayed there for a moment, her nose close to his face. He did not die of old age. Merit whispered. She looked at the empty gold cup on the floor. "I smell something bitter. It is the smell of a rare plant from the south." This plant is a deadly poison. Kamos looked at the dark stain on the rug. So, someone killed him. Merritt nodded slowly. Yes. His body shows the signs. The blue color of the skin and the smell of the plant are clear. He died very quickly after drinking from that cup. Kamos told her about the missing ring. Merritt's face became very serious. In ancient Egypt, the signet ring was a symbol of great power. Without it, the temple's treasures and secrets were not safe. This is a dangerous secret, Merritt said. She looked at the door. If the killer knows we are here, we are in danger too. We must tell the Pharaoh. But we must be careful. We do not know who we can trust in this temple. Kamos looked at his friend. They were just a scribe and a healer. But now they were in the middle of a dark crime. The sun was high outside, but the room felt colder than ever. Kamos looked at the priest's bare fingers again. The skin was pale and thin. Usually, the high priest wore a very large gold ring. It was heavy and bright. The ring had a dark red stone in the center. A small hawk was carved into the stone. This hawk was the symbol of the god Horus. The ring was not just a beautiful piece of jewelry. It was a tool of great power. With this ring, the high priest signed every important paper for the temple. He used it to lock the heavy wooden doors of the gold room. He also used it to seal the large jars of grain for the city. It is truly gone, Kamos said. His voice was a whisper. He knelt on the floor and looked under the large wooden desk. He saw only dust and the small legs of the chair. He moved the heavy gold cup with his hand. It made a soft, scraping sound against the stone floor. There was nothing under the cup. He checked the folds of the priest's white linen kilt. He searched the floor near the priest's feet. The ring was nowhere in the room. Merritt watched him. She looked at the door and then back at the body. This is a great problem, Kamos, she said. The person who has that ring can take the temple's gold. They can write letters and say they are from the high priest. They can control the workers and the guards. They can tell lies, and people will believe them because of the seal. Kamos stood up and wiped his hands on his kilt. He felt a bead of sweat run down his face. The thief did not just want the priest to die, Kamos said. The thief wanted the power of the temple. This was a dark plan. He looked at the desk again. There were many papyrus scrolls on the table. Some were open, and some were closed. Kamos knew these scrolls well. He was the one who wrote the numbers and names on them. He noticed that one scroll was moved from its place. It was a list of the temple's secret rooms and treasure boxes. The edges of the papyrus were slightly torn. Someone had looked at it with fast, nervous hands. We must tell the Pharaoh immediately, Kamos decided. He is the only man with more power than the high priest. If we wait, the thief will use the ring. They will cause great trouble in the city of Thebes. Merritt nodded. She picked up her bag of medicines. I will stay here for a moment, she said. I must cover the body with a clean cloth. It is not right to leave him like this. You must go to the palace. But be careful, Kamos. The person with the ring might be watching you right now. They know you are the scribe who sees everything. Kamos felt a shiver of fear. He looked at the shadows in the corners of the room. The painted gods on the walls seemed to watch him with their large, still eyes. He nodded to Merritt and walked toward the door. He had to be fast. He had to reach the palace before the sun began to set. Kamos left the temple and walked toward the royal palace. The palace was a very large building with white walls that shone in the hot sun. Many guards stood at the tall gates. They held long spears and looked very strong. Kamos felt small in front of them. He was only a scribe with a wooden pallet and a roll of papyrus. I must see the Pharaoh, Kamos said to the head guard. "I have important news about the high priest." The guard looked at Kamos for a long time. Then he nodded and opened the heavy gate. He led Kamos through the palace. The floors were made of polished stone that felt cool under his feet. The walls were covered in gold and bright blue paint. They passed through many rooms until they reached the great hall. The pharaoh sat on a high gold throne. He was a tall man with a short black beard and a strong face. He wore a crown with a golden snake on the front. He looked at Kamos with sharp, dark eyes. The room was very quiet. "What is your news, scribe?" the pharaoh asked. His voice was deep and filled the large room. Kamos knelt on the floor. He put his forehead to the cold stone. "Great Pharaoh," he said, "the high priest, Amunher, is dead. He was poisoned in his office this morning." The pharaoh stood up quickly. The sound of his heavy gold jewelry hitting his chest was clear in the silent hall. "Poisoned?" he shouted. "In my temple? Who did this?" "I do not know, Great Pharaoh," Kamos replied. "But his signet ring is missing. Someone took the power of the temple with them." The pharaoh walked down the steps of his throne. He walked back and forth across the room. His face was full of anger and worry. He knew that without the ring, the city could fall into chaos. People would be afraid. The laws of the temple would be broken. He needed the ring to keep the city safe. He stopped in front of Kamos and looked down at him. "You are the scribe who found him. You know the temple and you know the people who work there. I give you a command. You have 3 days to find the killer. You must find the missing ring and bring it back to me." Kamos felt a heavy weight on his shoulders. 3 days was a very short time to solve such a big mystery. "And if I do not find them, Great Pharaoh?" The pharaoh's face was hard and serious. "Then the temple will remain closed, and the gods will be angry with Thebes. We cannot have a killer in our city. Go now. Take the healer Merit with you. Use your eyes and your mind. Find the truth." Kamos stood up and bowed. He left the great hall with a fast heart. He had the pharaoh's command, but he also had a great danger. He had to start his search immediately. Kamos walked away from the white walls of the palace. The afternoon sun was very hot on his back. He felt the weight of the pharaoh's command in his mind. 3 days was a very short time. He needed to find a person who saw the high priest early that morning. Most people were asleep when the priest died, but the guards were always awake. He walked back toward the great temple. He did not go to the main entrance with the giant statues. Instead, he went to a small side gate. This gate was used by workers and lower guards. He saw a man standing near the stone wall. The man's name was Beck. He was a tall, strong guard with a bronze spear. But today he did not look strong. He looked tired and his hands were shaking. Kamos moved closer to him. He watched Beck for a minute. The guard looked at the street, then at the sky, and then at his own feet. He was very nervous. When Kamos stepped into the light, Beck jumped. The metal head of his spear hit the stone wall. "Kamos, you scared me," Beck said. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Why are you so jumpy, Beck?" Kamos asked quietly. "The sun is high, and the city is peaceful." Beck looked around to see if anyone was listening. He leaned toward Kamos. "The city is not peaceful, scribe. I heard the news. The high priest is dead. People are talking in the shadows." Kamos stepped closer. He spoke in a low voice. "You were at this gate early this morning, Beck. The sun was not yet up. Did you see anyone leave the temple? Did you see anyone go toward the high priest's rooms?" Beck did not answer immediately. He gripped his spear so hard that his knuckles turned white. He looked at the ground. I saw a shadow. He whispered. It was very early. The sky was still grey. A person walked out of the side door. They wore a long, dark cloak with a hood. I could not see their face. Did they say anything? Kamos asked. No. Beck said. But they walked very fast. They carried a small leather bag. When they passed me, I smelled something strange. It was a sharp, bitter smell. It was not the smell of the temple incense. It was the smell of the desert plants that grow far to the south. Kamos felt a jump in his heart. That was the same smell Merritt described. The smell of the poison. Which way did the shadow go? Beck. Beck pointed toward the crowded market near the river. They disappeared into the narrow streets. I wanted to stop them. But I was afraid. There was something cold about that person. Kamos thanked the guard and started to walk away. But then he stopped and turned back. Beck, why did you not tell the head of the guards? Beck looked at the palace and then back at Kamos. His eyes were full of fear. Because the head of the guards told us to stay at our posts and look at nothing. He said the high priest wanted to be alone. Kamos nodded slowly. This was a new and dangerous piece of the puzzle. He needed to find Merritt and tell her about the shadow and the strange command from the head of the guards. Kamos hurried back to the House of Life. He found Merritt in her workroom. The room was filled with the smell of dried flowers and old earth. Merritt was sitting at a heavy wooden table. In front of her was a small piece of cloth. The cloth was wet with the dark liquid from the priest's office. She was looking at it very closely. Merritt. Kamos said as he entered. I talked to the guard at the side gate. He saw someone in a dark cloak this morning. The person smelled like the poison. He also said the head of the guards told everyone to stay away from the priest's rooms. Merritt looked up. Her face was very serious. That is a very important thing to know. Kamos. It means the killer had help from inside the palace. But look at this. She pointed to the table. Next to the wet cloth were 3 small glass bottles. They were thin and long. Inside the bottles was a thick, blue liquid. It was the color of the deep sky just before the sun disappears. Where did you find those? Kamos asked. He did not touch them. He knew they were dangerous. I went back to the priest's office after you left for the palace. Merritt explained. I looked inside the large chest where he kept his clean robes. These vials were hidden in the bottom, under the linen. The person who killed him was in a hurry. They probably dropped these when they took the ring. Kamos looked at the bottles. The glass was very clear and expensive. Is this the poison? Merritt nodded. She took a small wooden stick and dipped it into one of the vials. She held it up to the light. Yes. It is made from a flower that grows only in the lands far to the south. It is very hard to find in Thebes. Only a few people in this city have the gold to buy this. And only a few people know how to turn the flower into a drink. So, the killer is rich. Kamos said. He felt the mystery becoming bigger. And they have a friend in the guards. There is something else. Merritt added. She turned one of the vials around. There was a small mark on the bottom of the glass. It looked like a tiny bird with its wings open. This is the mark of a specific glassmaker. There is only one man in the market who makes bottles like this. His name is Ibe. Kamos felt a bit of hope. Then we must find Ibe. If he made these bottles, he knows who bought them. Be careful. Merritt warned. The person who bought these bottles already killed a high priest. They will not be afraid to kill a scribe or a healer. Kamos took a deep breath. He felt the weight of the 3 days given by the Pharaoh. One day was already passing. He looked at the blue vials. They were beautiful, but they were the tools of a murderer. He and Merit had to move fast. They needed to find the glassmaker before the sun went down. Kamos left Merit at the House of Life. The sun was going down behind the distant mountains. The sky was a deep orange and purple. He walked back toward the great temple. He wanted to look at the priest's office one more time. Perhaps he missed a small clue in the dark corners. The temple was very different at night. The giant pillars made long, dark shadows on the stone floor. Only a few torches burned on the high walls. Their yellow flames moved back and forth in the light wind. Kamos walked quickly. His leather sandals made a soft, brushing sound on the stone. Suddenly, he stopped. He held his breath and listened. He thought he heard another sound behind him. It was a faint scraping sound, like a foot moving over dry sand. He turned his head and looked into the darkness of the long hallway. He saw nothing. The shadows were deep and stayed perfectly still. "Is someone there?" Kamos asked. His voice sounded very loud in the quiet temple. No one answered him. He waited for a moment, but the only sound was the crackling of the fire in the torches. He started walking again. He moved faster this time. His heart was beating quickly in his chest. He reached the Hall of Records and walked past his small wooden desk. He looked back over his shoulder again. This time, he saw something. A dark shape moved behind a large stone pillar. It was tall and wore a dark cloak with a hood. It was the same shadow the guard, Beck, described this morning. Kamos felt a cold wave of fear. He was not a soldier or a fighter. He was a man of books and ink. He did not have a spear or a bronze knife. He only had his wooden pallet in his hand. He turned a corner and began to run. He tried to be quiet, but his breath was heavy and fast. The hallway was very long. He could hear the footsteps behind him now. They were faster and heavier than before. The person was definitely following him. Kamos saw a small wooden door on his right side. It led to a narrow stone staircase. He pushed the door open and went inside. He climbed the steps in the dark. He reached a small balcony high above the main hall of the temple. From the balcony, he looked down. He saw the person in the dark cloak. The person stood at the bottom of the stairs. They held a long, thin knife. The metal of the knife caught the light of a distant torch and shone brightly. The person looked up toward the balcony. Kamos pulled his head back into the darkness. He did not move. He did not even breathe. The silence was very heavy. Kamos waited for a long time. Finally, he heard the sound of the person walking away. The footsteps grew quieter and then stopped completely. Kamos stayed on the high balcony for many minutes. He knew now that the killer was near. They did not want him to find the truth about the high priest. The mystery was now a race for his life. He had to find the glassmaker Ibe. But he had to be very careful. Kamos stayed on the balcony for a long time. He did not want to move. His heart was still beating very fast. He listened to the quiet air of the temple. After many minutes, he was sure the person in the dark cloak was gone. He slowly walked down the stone stairs. He did not use a torch because he did not want to be seen. He moved like a shadow against the walls. He reached the spot where the person stood at the bottom of the stairs. He looked at the floor. The stone was smooth and old. He knelt down and moved his hands across the ground. His fingers hit something small and cold. It was made of metal. He picked it up and walked to the nearest torch on the wall to look at it. In the yellow light of the flame, Kamos saw a beautiful object. It was a small scarab made of solid gold. A scarab is a beetle, and in Egypt, it is a symbol of luck and new life. But this was not a common piece of jewelry. The back of the beetle was covered in tiny, bright blue stones. They were lapis lazuli, a very expensive stone from far away. Kamos turned the scarab over in his hand. The blue of the stones was exactly the same color as the poison in Merit's glass vials. He felt a cold shiver. This scarab did not belong to the high priest. A munher always wore gold and red, the colors of his office. This blue scarab belonged to someone else. It probably fell from the killer's cloak during the chase. This is a very important clue. Kamos whispered to himself. He looked at the detail of the gold work. The legs of the beetle were very thin and perfect. Only a master jeweler could make something so fine. This confirmed what Merit said earlier. The person involved in this crime was very rich. They had enough gold to buy rare poisons and expensive jewelry. Kamos put the golden scarab into a small leather pouch at his belt. He needed to show this to Merit immediately. He also needed to ask her if she knew any rich men or women who wore such things. In Thebes, the rich people liked to show their wealth. They wore many rings and necklaces. A golden scarab with blue stones was very special. Someone would remember seeing it. He walked out of the temple through a different door. The night air was cool now. The stars were bright above the desert. Kamos did not go back to his own house. He felt that his house was no longer safe. The person with the knife knew he was looking for the truth. He walked through the quiet streets toward the House of Life. He kept his hand on the leather pouch. He felt the weight of the gold. It was a small object, but it was a heavy secret. He had to stay alive to tell the Pharaoh what he found. Kamos reached the House of Life just as the first light of morning touched the river. He found Merit in the small garden. She was picking white flowers for a medicine. He showed her the golden scarab. Merit's eyes went wide. She touched the bright blue stones with a careful finger. "This is very rare," she said. "These blue stones are from the mountains in the east. Only a few merchants in the market sell things like this. It is the jewelry of a very wealthy person." Kamos told her about the chase in the temple. He told her about the person with the knife. Merit looked worried. She put her hand on his arm. "You must be careful, Kamos. The market is a busy place, but a knife can hide in any shadow. The person who dropped this will want it back." Kamos nodded. He left Merit and walked to the great market of Thebes. It was a place of loud voices and many smells. He saw men selling fresh fish from the Nile and women buying red fruit and onions. He walked past the food and went to the area of the jewelry sellers. He stopped in front of a large, beautiful shop. The owner was a man named Antef. Antef was a very rich merchant. He wore a fine linen kilt and a heavy necklace made of silver. He was known for selling the most expensive stones in the city. When Kamos walked into the shop, Antef was talking to a servant. When he saw the scribe, he stopped talking immediately. He quickly put his hands inside the long, wide sleeves of his robe. He looked nervous. "Greetings, Antef," Kamos said. He kept his voice calm. Antef did not smile. He did not move his hands from his sleeves. "What do you want, scribe?" "I am a busy man. I have many orders for the palace." Kamos looked around the shop. He saw many beautiful rings and necklaces, but no blue stones. "I am looking for a special piece of jewelry," Kamos said. "A golden beetle with blue stones. A scarab. Have you seen such a thing recently?" Antef's face became very still. He did not look Kamos in the eye. He looked at a spot on the floor. "No," he said. His voice was thin. "I do not sell such things. Blue stones are very hard to find this year. Maybe you should look in another city like Memphis." Kamos watched the merchant closely. Antef held his arms very tight against his body. It was a hot morning, but the merchant looked like he was freezing. "That is strange," Kamos said. I heard you were the best merchant in Thebes. I thought you made jewelry for the high priest. He was very interested in these stones. When Kamos mentioned the high priest, Antef's face turned pale. He stepped back into the shadows of his shop. I told you. I know nothing. The high priest is dead, and I have no more business with the temple. Now, leave me. I have work to do. Kamos walked away from the shop, but he did not go far. He stood behind a stone wall and watched Antef. He knew the merchant was lying. The man was afraid of something. Kamos wondered why he hid his hands. Was he the person from the temple? Or was he hiding a secret for someone even more powerful? Kamos walked back to the great temple. His mind was full of thoughts about Antef the merchant. The man was definitely hiding a secret. Why did he hide his hands? Why was he so afraid of the high priest's name? Kamos needed a quiet place to think. He went to the Hall of Records. It was his second home. The hall was empty now. Most scribes were at the market or working in the lower gardens. Kamos sat at his small wooden desk. He looked at his reed pens and his cakes of ink. Everything looked the same, but he felt something was different. He was a man who noticed small details. He saw a tiny piece of dry papyrus on the floor near his chair. It was not his. He always kept his workspace very clean. He looked at the top of his desk. His wooden pallet was moved just a few inches to the left. Someone had been here. Someone searched his things while he was at the market. Kamos felt a cold sweat on his neck. Was the killer looking for the golden scarab? Or were they looking for something else? Kamos had a secret place in his desk. Many years ago, he carved a small hole under the main wood. He used it to hide his most important letters. He reached under the desk and felt the wood. His fingers found the small piece of wood that moved. He pushed it. A small, thin scroll of papyrus fell out into his hand. Wait. This was not his letter. This was a new scroll. It was tied with a simple piece of black string. Kamos opened it carefully. The papyrus was soft and expensive. The writing was very familiar. It was the handwriting of the high priest. Amunha. Kamos, my friend. The letter began. If you are reading this, I am in great danger. I have found a shadow in the house of gold. Someone is stealing the Pharaoh's wealth. They are using a false seal to move the gold. I suspect the head of the guards, but I have no proof yet. I have hidden the real proof inside the statue of Bastet in the small garden. Be careful. The shadow is everywhere. Kamos read the words again. His heart was beating very fast. The high priest knew someone was coming for him. He tried to tell Kamos, but he died before he could speak. The letter was a warning from the dead. The high priest trusted Kamos even when he was afraid for his life. Suddenly, Kamos heard a sound. It was the sound of a heavy door opening at the end of the hall. He quickly put the scroll into his kilt. He grabbed a pen and pretended to write on a blank piece of papyrus. He did not look up, but he felt a cold wind. He knew someone tall was standing in the doorway. The shadow was back, and it was watching him. Kamos waited until the shadow moved away from the door. He did not look up from his desk. He kept his eyes on the blank papyrus and held his breath. When the hallway was finally silent again, he tucked the high priest's letter deep into his belt. He left the Hall of Records through a small back door used by the cleaners. He ran all the way to the House of Life, taking the long way to make sure no one followed him. He did not stop until he saw Merit. Merit was in her lab. This was a private room filled with tall wooden shelves. On the shelves were hundreds of small clay jars. Some jars held dried flowers and ground roots. Others held stranger things, like the teeth of crocodiles or the scales of snakes. Merit was standing over a heavy stone bowl. She was wearing a thick linen apron to protect her clothes. "Kamos, you are back," she said. She did not look up from her work. She was very focused on the task. "Come and see this. I have been working with the blue liquid from the vials we found." Kamos walked to the table. He felt the heat from a small charcoal fire burning in a bronze pot in the corner of the room. "What did you find?" he asked. He was still breathing hard from his run, and his legs felt weak. Merit took a small wooden spoon. She picked up a tiny bit of white powder from a nearby jar. "This powder is made from crushed limestone," she explained. "Usually, if you mix it with water, nothing happens. It just stays white. But watch what happens when it touches the blue liquid." She dropped a single bead of the blue poison into the bowl with the white powder. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, the mixture began to change color quickly. It did not stay blue. It turned a very dark, ugly black. A thin trail of gray smoke rose from the bowl and moved slowly through the air. The smell was terrible. It was sharp and it made Kamos's eyes water. It smelled like rotting fish and bitter desert almonds. "This is the breath of Apep," Merit said. Her voice was low and full of fear. "It is the most dangerous poison in all of Egypt. It does not come from our gardens here in Thebes. The plant only grows in the dark marshes far to the south, beyond the great waterfalls of the Nile." "Is it common?" Kamos asked, stepping back from the smoke. Merit shook her head. "No. It is very rare. Only the royal healers and the most powerful priests are allowed to even talk about it. It kills a man in seconds. It stops the heart so quickly that the person cannot even cry out for help. It is a silent death." Kamos felt a cold weight in his stomach. The high priest knew he was in danger. "I found a letter in my desk. Merit. He wrote it before he died. He said someone is stealing the Pharaoh's gold. He mentioned the head of the guards." Merit looked at the black liquid in her bowl. "The head of the guards is a powerful man. He has many soldiers and many eyes. If he is the killer, we are in more danger than I thought. He has the gold to buy this poison. He can move through the palace at night without anyone stopping him." Kamos looked at his friend. The high priest hid proof in the statue of Bastet in the small garden. "We must go there. But the sun is high now. There are too many people watching. We must wait for the shadows of the evening." Merit nodded slowly. She poured cool water over the black poison to destroy it. "We will wait," she said. "But keep your eyes open. Kamos. The shadow from the hall will not wait for long." Kamos walked back to the Hall of Records. He wanted to understand the high priest's letter. If someone was stealing gold, there must be a record of the rules. The Hall of Records was a very large room. It had many tall wooden shelves. The shelves were filled with thousands of papyrus scrolls. Some scrolls were new and white. Others were very old and yellow. Kamos went to the section for temple laws. This part of the library was very dusty. It seemed that no one had looked at these scrolls for a long time. He moved his lamp closer to the shelf. He looked for a scroll with the seal of the high priest. He found one in the corner. It was covered in a thick layer of gray dust. He blew the dust away and opened the scroll carefully. The papyrus was dry, and it felt like it might break in his hands. The scroll was written by a munher only 1 month ago. It was not a finished law yet. It was a draft. Kamos read the words slowly. "The Law of the Gold House." The title said, the high priest wanted to change an old rule. In the past, the head of the guards was allowed to go into the treasure room alone. He had the key, and he did not need a witness. But the high priest wrote, This rule is not safe. The gold of the Pharaoh must be protected. From this day, the head of the guards must never enter the gold house alone. He must always have a scribe and a priest with him. They must count the gold together. Kamos felt a cold wind of understanding. If this law became real, the head of the guards could not steal anymore. He would lose his power and his secret wealth. The high priest was planning to show this law to the Pharaoh this week. The motive for the murder was now very clear. This is why he died. Kamos said to himself. The head of the guards found out about this new rule. He killed the priest to stop the law. Kamos looked at the dates on the scroll. The high priest planned to talk to the Pharaoh yesterday, but he died that morning. The timing was perfect for a killer. Kamos heard a voice outside the room. It was a deep, loud voice. It belonged to General Hapu, the head of the guards. He was talking to another soldier in the hallway. Find the scribe. Hapu said. He is looking for things that do not belong to him. Bring him to me immediately. Kamos quickly rolled up the scroll. He could not stay in the library. He had to hide. He tucked the dusty scroll under his arm and looked for another way out. The shadows of the library felt like they were closing in on him. He had the motive now, but he still needed the proof hidden in the statue of Bastet. He moved quietly toward the back of the room, hoping the darkness would keep him safe. Kamos stayed in the deep shadows of the library. He heard the heavy footsteps of the guards outside. They were searching for him. He waited until the voices grew quiet. Then, he crawled through a small window and dropped onto the soft sand outside. He ran through the narrow back streets of Thebes. He did not go to his house. He went straight to the House of Life. Merit. Kamos whispered when he found her. She was waiting by the garden gate. The head of the guards knows I am looking for the truth. He sent soldiers to find me. We cannot stay here. Merit grabbed her bag of medicines. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp. Then we must leave the East Bank. She said. The guards will check every house in the city, but they do not often go to the West Bank at night. The West Bank was the place of the tombs. Most people in Thebes stayed away from it after the sun went down. They believed the spirits of the dead walked there. But Kamos and Merit were not afraid of spirits. They were afraid of living men with sharp knives. They walked quickly toward the Nile River. The moon was a bright silver circle in the sky. It cast a long, shimmering light over the moving water. The river was wide and powerful. Kamos saw many large ships with white sails, but they were too big for a secret trip. He looked for something smaller. Near the edge of the water, they found a small wooden boat. An old man sat near it, fixing a fishing net. His skin was dark and wrinkled like old leather. Old man. Kamos said, "We need to cross the river. We have gold for your time." The fisherman looked at Kamos and then at Merit. He saw the worry on their faces. He did not ask questions. In Thebes, it was often better not to know the secrets of others. He stood up and pointed to the boat. "Get in," he said. His voice was low and rough. Kamos and Merit sat in the middle of the boat. The fisherman pushed the boat into the water. He picked up the long wooden oars. The oars hit the surface of the river. With every stroke, the boat moved further away from the city lights. The air on the river was cool and smelled of wet earth and green plants. Kamos looked back at the great temple. It looked like a giant mountain of stone against the stars. He felt the dusty scroll under his kilt. He thought about the witness they were going to see. Merit had heard about a man who lived on the West Bank. He was an old worker who once carved stones for the temple. He claimed he saw a secret group of men moving gold boxes near the river late at night. The boat moved silently across the dark water. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the oars. Kamos watched the west bank grow larger. The tall cliffs of the desert looked like black walls. They were entering a land of silence and secrets. The small boat reached the west bank of the Nile. The sand here was cool and felt soft under their feet. Kamos and Merit stepped out of the boat. They thanked the fisherman and walked away from the water. The west bank was very quiet. There were no busy markets or loud crowds here. There were only the tall cliffs and the silent houses of the workers who built the royal tombs. They walked for a short time until they reached a small house made of mud bricks. A small fire burned in front of the door. An old man sat on a wooden stool near the fire. His hands were covered in white dust, and he held a small copper tool. This was Seti, the stone carver. He was an adult who had spent many years making beautiful things for the rich people of Thebes. Seti, Merit said softly, "We need your help." The old man looked up. His eyes were cloudy, but he looked at Merit with a smile. "Merit, the healer. You fixed my back last summer. Why are you here in the middle of the night?" Kamos stepped forward. He took the golden scarab from his leather pouch and held it out. The gold caught the orange light of the fire. Seti put down his tool and took the scarab. He held it close to his face. He touched the blue stones with his thumb. "This is my work," Seti said. His voice was full of pride. "I carved these blue stones. They are lapis lazuli from the far mountains. It is very hard stone to cut, but I made them smooth." "Who did you make this for, Seti?" Kamos asked. He leaned closer. "Did you make it for the high priest?" Seti shook his head. "No. The high priest liked red stones. He liked the color of the sun. I made this scarab for a different man. He came to my house 3 months ago. He wore a fine linen kilt and had many gold armbands. He did not tell me his name, but he looked like a man from the palace." "Can you describe him?" Kamos asked. "He was a tall man," Seti said. "He had a long scar on his left arm. He was very impatient. He gave me a lot of gold to finish the work quickly. He said the scarab was a gift for a friend." Kamos looked at Merit. The head of the guards, Hapu, was a tall man. He was a soldier. A scar on the arm was a common thing for a man who fought with swords. "Did he order anything else?" Merit asked. Seti nodded. "Yes. He also ordered a copy of a ring. He brought a piece of wax with the shape of a hawk on it. I told him I do not make rings. I only carve stones. But he insisted. He said he would pay me double. So, I carved the red stone for the ring, and a jeweler in the market made the gold part." Kamos felt the pieces of the mystery coming together. The killer had a fake ring made. They used the fake ring to trick people. Or maybe they kept the real one and used the fake one as a distraction. "Thank you, Seti," Kamos said. He reached into his pouch and gave the old man a small piece of silver. Seti took the silver and looked at the dark desert. "Be careful, young man. The man with the scar is not a kind person. He has a heart of stone." Kamos held the golden scarab tightly in his hand. The blue stones looked like tiny, glowing eyes in the firelight. Seti sat back on his wooden stool and looked at the dark desert sky. He seemed to be remembering the day the mysterious man arrived. He wanted a ring, Seti said again. His voice was low and serious. He wanted a perfect copy of the high priest's signet ring, the one with the hawk. Kamos felt a cold wind blow from the river. Why would a man want a copy of such a powerful thing? To have that ring is to have the voice of the temple. Seti shrugged his old shoulders. "I do not ask why. I am a simple carver. I only carve the stones. The man brought a piece of dark wax. It had the shape of the hawk already pressed into it. It was a perfect copy of the priest's seal. I carved the red stone to fit that shape. Merit looked at Kamos with worry in her eyes. If he has a copy of the ring, he can seal any letter. He can send orders to the temple guards. He can even open the treasure boxes in the gold house. No one would stop him because the seal is the law. Did he come to your house alone? Kamos asked. He wanted to know if the man had many friends. No. Seti replied. He had 2 men with him. They did not wear the temple uniforms. They wore plain white linen, but they carried heavy military swords. They looked like men who knew how to fight. They stood near the door and watched the road. Seti leaned forward so only Kamos and Merit could hear him. There is more. The man was not just a common soldier. He had the smell of the palace on him. He used expensive flower oils. And he had the scar I told you about. A long, white line from his elbow to his wrist on the left arm. Kamos knew that scar. Everyone in Thebes knew that scar. General Hapu, the head of the guards, was a hero of the northern wars. People said he received that wound while saving a high official from a desert lion. It is Hapu. Kamos whispered. Merit nodded slowly. It must be him. But we need more than just a description. Seti, you said a jeweler in the market made the gold part of the ring. Yes. The old man said. His name is Ibi. He has a small shop in the street of the metalworkers. He is a very clever man. But he likes gold too much. He will do anything for a high price. He is the one who finished the ring. Kamos stood up. The fire was dying now. Only orange coals remained in the sand. We must find Ibi. If he made the ring, he might still have the wax model. Or he might know where Hapu is hiding the gold. But the market is on the east bank. Merit reminded him. The guards are searching for you there. It is the most dangerous place for us to be. Kamos looked at the river. The water was dark and deep. We will go at dawn. We will hide among the vegetable sellers. They bring their food to the market in large baskets every morning. The guards will not look at 2 simple workers. Seti watched them walk away. Be careful, my friends. He called out. The man with the scar does not like witnesses. He has the power of a general and the heart of a crocodile. The sun began to rise over the hills of the west bank. The sky turned from dark blue to a soft pink. Kamos and Merit did not sleep. They found some old, dirty linen clothes in a pile of cloth near the river. Kamos put on a rough kilt. Merit covered her head with a plain grey scarf. They looked like 2 poor workers from the desert. They found a group of farmers who were loading baskets of onions and garlic onto a large boat. The farmers were busy and tired. They did not look at Kamos or Merit. Kamos picked up a heavy basket and carried it to the boat. Merit took a smaller bag of dried beans. They stayed close to the other workers as the boat moved across the water toward the east bank. When they reached the city, the market was already starting to wake up. Kamos whispered to Merit. Go to the street of the metalworkers. Find Ibi the jeweler. I must check on Beck, the guard. He was very afraid yesterday. I want to know if he is safe. Merit nodded. Be careful. Kamos. The city feels different today. There are more guards on every corner. Kamos walked away from the market. He went to the small district where the temple guards lived. The houses here were small and made of sun-dried mud. They were built very close together. He found the house of Beck near the back of the temple wall. It was a very simple house with a low wooden door. Kamos stopped in front of the door. He looked around to make sure no one was watching him. He reached out and knocked. There was no answer. He waited for a moment and knocked again. Harder this time. The door was not locked. It moved back a few inches. "Beck!" Kamos whispered. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside the house was cold and smelled of old dust. The room was small and dark. There was a single bed made of wood and rope in the corner. A small wooden table stood in the middle of the room. The house was a mess. The table was turned over on its side. A clay jar of water was broken on the floor. The water was dry now, leaving a dark mark on the ground. Kamos saw a piece of bread on the floor. It was covered in ants. This meant the bread had been there for many hours. He walked to the bed. The blankets were pulled off and lay on the floor. Kamos looked under the bed, but he found nothing. There were no signs of Beck. The guard's spear was missing. His leather sandals were missing, too. Kamos felt a cold fear in his chest. Beck did not leave because he wanted to. Someone had come to this house and taken him. Or perhaps Beck ran away because he knew his life was in danger. Kamos saw a small piece of blue stone on the floor near the broken jar. He picked it up. It was a tiny piece of lapis lazuli. It was the same blue stone from the golden scarab. The killer had been here. Kamos realized that anyone who knew the truth was in danger. He had to find Merritt and leave the area quickly. Merritt walked through the street of the metalworkers. The sun was higher now, and the heat was rising from the stone floor. The air was thick and smelled of charcoal fire and melting copper. Men hit metal with heavy hammers. The rhythm of the hammers filled the narrow street. Merritt held her plain grey scarf tight around her face and neck. She did not want anyone to recognize her as the famous healer from the House of Life. She was looking for the small shop of Ibi the jeweler. Seti the stone carver said Ibi was a very clever man with gold. But as Merritt walked, she felt a prickle on her skin. It was the feeling of eyes watching her. She did not look back. She knew that if she looked back, the person would know she was afraid. She stopped at a small stall that sold bronze statues of the gods. She picked up a heavy statue of a cat and pretended to look at its eyes. The bronze was polished and bright. In the reflection of the metal, she saw the street behind her. A man stood near a thick stone pillar. He was tall and wore a plain white kilt. He did not look like a merchant. He did not have any goods to sell. He did not look like a buyer because he did not look at the shops. He was looking only at Merritt. He stayed very still, like a hunter waiting for a bird. When Merritt moved, he moved. When Merritt stopped, he stopped. Merritt felt her heart beat faster in her chest. She was a brave woman, but she was alone in a busy part of the city. Kamos was far away, searching for Beck. She had to lead this man away from Iby's shop. If the killer saw her talking to the jeweler, Iby might be killed too. She turned into a very narrow alleyway between two tall buildings. The walls were made of rough mud bricks and they were very high. There was no sun in this alley. It was dark, cool, and smelled of old water. Merritt began to run. Her leather sandals made a soft sound on the dusty ground. She heard the heavy sound of the man's footsteps behind her. They were getting closer. She turned another corner and saw a large wooden door that was half open. She jumped inside and pulled the door shut with all her strength. She stood in the dark, silent room and pressed her back against the wood. A heavy hand hit the door from the outside. Merritt jumped, but she did not make a sound. She waited. Her breath was fast and loud in her ears. Then, she heard the sound of the man walking away. His footsteps grew quiet and then disappeared into the noise of the market. Merritt stayed in the darkness for a long time. She knew the shadow was still out there, searching for her. She had to be more careful than ever. She waited until her heart was calm. Then she slowly opened the door to find Iby. Merit walked carefully out of the dark room. She looked at the busy street. The man in the white kilt was nowhere to be seen. She moved quickly toward a small shop with a sign of a golden hammer. This was the shop of Ibe the jeweler. The air inside was hot and smelled of smoke. Inside the shop, a small man with very large glasses sat at a table. He was looking at a piece of gold through a crystal. This was Ibe. He looked up when Merit entered, but he did not smile. He looked nervous. He was not alone. A rough-looking man stood in the corner. The man wore a dirty linen tunic and held a small leather bag. "I told you. I cannot give you more gold for this," Ibe said to the man. His voice was shaking. The rough man stepped forward. He pulled a heavy gold necklace out of his bag. "This is royal gold." The man growled. "Look at the red stones. They are from the south. This is worth more than 10 bags of grain." Merit felt a shock in her heart. She knew that necklace. She had seen it many times around the neck of the high priest. Among her, during the great festivals. It had 5 large red stones and a golden hawk in the center. It was a holy object from the temple. "I cannot buy this," Ibe whispered. "If the guards see this in my shop, they will take me to the desert mines. This belongs to the temple." The rough man laughed, but it was not a happy sound. "The temple does not need it anymore. The high priest is dead. The new masters of the gold do not care about old necklaces. They want pieces of gold they can hide." Merit stayed near the door. She tried to look like a simple worker waiting for a ring. She watched the rough man's hands. He had thick, dirty fingers. He was not a jeweler or a scribe. He looked like a man who worked in the palace kitchens or the stables. "I will give you 3 pieces of silver," Ibe said finally. He reached into a wooden box and pulled out the metal. The man snatched the silver and threw the necklace onto Ibe's table. "Fine. But do not tell anyone you saw me, little jeweler. My friends are very powerful." The man turned and walked out of the shop. He pushed past Merit without looking at her face. Merit waited for a moment. Then she stepped toward Ibe's table. Ibe was trying to hide the necklace under a piece of black cloth. "That is a beautiful piece of history," Merit said softly. Ibe jumped. He looked at Merit with wide, fearful eyes. I do not know what you mean. This is just old metal. I am going to melt it down." "Do not melt it, Ibe," Merit said. She leaned closer. "I am Merit, the healer from the House of Life. I know who owned that necklace. And I know about the copy of the signet ring you made for the man with the scar." Ibe's face turned the color of gray ash. He dropped his crystal. It hit the wooden table with a dull sound. "Please," he whispered. "They told me they would kill me if I spoke. I only did what they asked." Ibe was shaking so much that his glasses almost fell off his face. "Please, Healer Merit," he said. His voice was a thin whisper. "I am just a man who works with gold. When a powerful person like the general comes and asks for a ring, you do not say no. You do what he says." Merit kept her voice calm and steady. "I understand. Ibe, you were afraid. But the high priest is dead. The Pharaoh is very angry. If you help me now, I can try to help you. Who brought the wax model of the ring to your shop?" Ibe looked at the door. He looked at the black cloth covering the stolen necklace. It was a servant of the general. But the general himself came to check the work once. He has a long, white scar on his left arm, just like the stone carver said. He told me that if I told anyone about the ring, I would never see the sun again. Suddenly, the air in the small shop changed. Merit heard the sound of many men walking fast in the street. It was the rhythmic sound of heavy leather sandals hitting the stone floor. There was also the sound of metal hitting metal as spears moved against shields. The guards were coming. The guards. Ibi whispered. His face was now the color of dry bone. They are here for me. They know. Hide the necklace. Ibi. Merritt said quickly. But it was too late. The heavy wooden door of the shop was pushed open with great force. It hit the inner wall with a loud, heavy noise. 5 guards in white and gold uniforms stepped inside. They held long bronze spears, and their faces were hard. They looked very strong and very serious. The leader of the guards looked at Ibi. Then he looked at the jeweler's table. He reached out with a large hand and pulled the black cloth away. The high priest's gold necklace lay there in the light of the fire. The red stones shone brightly, like drops of blood on the wood. Ibi the jeweler. The guard said in a loud, hard voice. You have the property of the great temple. You have the gold of the gods. You are a thief. No. Ibi cried. He fell to his knees. I did not steal it. A rough man sold it to me only a few minutes ago. The guard did not listen to his words. He grabbed Ibi's arm and pulled him up from the floor. Another guard took the gold necklace and put it into a wooden box. He closed the lid with a sharp click. The Pharaoh wants to talk to you. The leader said. You are going to the palace for questioning. You will tell the judges the names of your friends. You will tell us where the rest of the gold is hidden. Merritt stood in the corner of the shop. She kept her head down and her face covered with her plain grey scarf. She tried to look like a simple worker waiting for a repair. The guards did not look at her. They only cared about the jeweler and the royal gold. They pushed Ibi out of the shop and into the busy street. Merritt walked to the door and watched them go. A large crowd of people stood in the street to watch the arrest. People were whispering and pointing their fingers. Ibi looked very small and very afraid between the tall, armed guards. Merritt knew she had to find Kamos immediately. This arrest changed everything. If Ibi talked to the Pharaoh's judges, General Hapu would know that his secret was in danger. The general would move fast to protect himself. She left the shop and walked quickly through the market, moving toward the temple gardens. The palace guards took Ibi to a small, cold room under the great hall. The walls were made of thick, grey stone. There were no windows, so the air felt heavy and old. A single oil lamp sat on a small wooden table. It made long, dancing shadows on the walls. Ibi sat on a hard stool. His hands were tied behind his back with a rough rope. He looked at the shadows and felt a great fear in his heart. The heavy wooden door opened with a slow, scraping sound. A man entered the room. He was a royal judge. He wore a long, clean white robe and a wig made of black sheep's wool. He looked very important and very stern. He sat down across from Ibi and looked at him for a long time without speaking. You are in a lot of trouble, Ibi. The judge said. His voice was cold and clear. The high priest's necklace was in your shop. This is a crime against the gods and the Pharaoh. Why do you have it? Did you take the life of a munher? Ibi shook his head so fast that his glasses moved. No, my lord. I am a peaceful man. I only work with gold. I did not kill the priest. I did not even know he was dead until the city began to whisper about it this morning. Then tell me where you got the gold. The judge commanded. The truth is your only friend today. Ibi took a deep, shaky breath. He looked at the door to make sure no one else was listening. A man came to my shop. Ibi began. It was many days ago. The sun was down and the streets were dark. The man wore a long, heavy cloak. A black mask covered his face. I could only see his dark eyes. They were cold, like the eyes of a snake. The judge leaned forward. A masked man. What did he say? He did not say much. Ivy whispered. He gave me a bag of broken gold jewelry. He told me to melt it into simple bars. He told me he would pay me well if I did the work quickly and stayed silent. He said that if I spoke to anyone, I would never see another morning. I was afraid, my lord. I took the gold. Was the necklace in that bag? The judge asked. No. Ivy said. The necklace came today. A rough man brought it. He said he was sent by the man in the mask. He told me to buy it or I would be punished. I think the masked man is the one who has the power. He is the one who killed the priest. The judge looked at the guards. Was this man tall? Did he have a scar on his arm? Ivy thought about the general's scar. He felt a cold sweat on his forehead. He knew that if he spoke the general's name here, he might die before he left the room. I do not know. Ivy lied. The cloak was very thick. It covered everything. Outside the room, Kamos and Merit were hiding behind a thick painted curtain in the hallway. They heard everything through the small gap in the door. He is lying about the scar. Kamos whispered into Merit's ear. He is too afraid of General Hapu. He knows the general is the man in the mask. Merit nodded slowly. Her face was full of worry. The judge will not believe him if he hides the truth. We must find our own proof. We must find the man in the mask ourselves. Kamos and Merit left the palace hallway quietly. They moved through the shadows of the large stone pillars. The sun was starting to move lower in the sky. The light was orange and long. They needed to find the proof the high priest mentioned in his letter. He wrote about the statue of Bastet in the small garden. The small garden was behind the high priest's private house. It was a beautiful place. But today it felt lonely. There were many tall palm trees and bright red flowers. A small pool of water sat in the center. Usually, the water was clear, but now it was covered in brown leaves. No one was there to clean it. Look for the statue of Bastet. Kamos whispered. He looked around the green plants. Bastet was the goddess with the head of a cat. She was a protector of the home. They found the statue in a quiet corner. It was made of smooth black stone. The cat sat very tall and straight. Its eyes were painted with bright gold. Merit walked around the statue. She looked at the base of the stone. Kamos, look at the ground, she said. She pointed to a pile of colorful clay pieces. Near the feet of the cat statue, a large vase lay broken on the stone floor. It was a beautiful vase with paintings of the blue Nile. It was broken into many sharp pieces. Merit knelt down and picked up a piece of the clay. She held it close to her nose. Do you smell that? She asked. Kamos leaned down. He smelled the sharp, bitter scent again. It was the same smell from the high priest's office. It was the smell of the breath of Apep. The killer was here. Kamos said. Why did they break the vase? Merit looked at the inside of a large clay piece. There was a sticky, dark blue mark on the clay. Maybe the poison was not just in the cup. Maybe the killer kept the poison here, hidden in the garden. Or maybe the high priest tried to hide something inside this vase before it broke. Kamos began to move the pieces of clay with his hands. He was careful not to cut his fingers. Under a large piece of the blue-painted clay, he saw something white. It was a small roll of papyrus. It was dry and safe. The high priest did hide it. Kamos said with excitement. He opened the small scroll. It was a list of names. Each name had a number of gold bars next to it. At the very top of the list was the name of General Hapu. Next to his name was a very large number. Below the names, the high priest wrote, The gold leaves the temple at the 3rd hour of the night. It goes to the house near the old canal. This is the proof. Merit whispered. She looked at the list. The general is not just stealing. He is paying these other men to help him. This is a group of thieves inside the palace. Suddenly, they heard the sound of a dry branch breaking behind them. Kamos froze. He did not hear a shout, but he felt the presence of someone else in the garden. He looked at Merit. Her eyes were wide with fear. They were not alone in the priest's garden anymore. The person who broke the vase was perhaps still watching the statue of Bastet. Kamos and Merit did not look back. They ran from the high priest's garden. They moved through the thick green leaves and hopped over the low stone wall. The sound of someone moving behind them was still there. It was the sound of heavy boots on the dry earth. They did not stop until they reached a busy street near the river. We cannot go to the palace with this list yet, Kamos said. He was breathing very fast. If General Hapu sees us, he will take the papyrus and kill us. We need more information about the people on this list. Merit wiped her face. The high priest mentioned a secret in his letter, but he did not say everything. There is one person who knew him better than anyone. Her name is Nefret. She is a priestess at the Temple of Bastet. The Temple of Bastet was in a different part of the city. It was a place of peace and many animals. As they walked toward it, Kamos felt the sun begin to set. The sky was now a deep, dark red. The temple was made of white stone with tall, thin pillars. Dozens of small cats sat on the steps. They watched the people with their bright, yellow eyes. Inside the temple, the air was sweet. It smelled of honey and fresh flowers. They found Nefret in a small room at the back. She was an older woman with silver hair and a kind, tired face. She was an adult who had lived in the temple for many years. She was sitting on a reed mat, feeding a small black cat. Kamos, she said. She did not look surprised to see him. I heard the sad news about Amunha. The heart of the city is heavy today. We are looking for the truth. Nefret, Kamos said. He sat down on the floor across from her. Merit sat beside him. The high priest was in danger. He knew people were stealing gold. But we think the mystery goes back many years. Can you tell us about his past? Nefret sighed. She looked at the gold eyes of the cat. Amunha was a good man, but he had a difficult life before he became the high priest. He was not always a man of the temple. When he was young, he had a brother. His name was Senefer. Kamos leaned forward. A brother? I never heard of a brother. That is because they had a great fight. Nefret explained. Her voice was very low. Senefer was a clever man, but he was greedy. He wanted power and gold. He tried to take money from the temple many years ago. Amunha found out and sent him away from Thebes. He told everyone his brother was dead to protect the family name. Is he really dead? Merit asked. Nefret shook her head slowly. I do not think so. Recently, Amunha looked very worried. He told me he saw a ghost from his past in the market. He thought his brother was back in Thebes. He thought Senefer was wearing a mask and working with dangerous men. Kamos looked at the list of names in his hand. He looked for the name Senefer, but it was not there. If the brother is back, he is hiding his name. Kamos said. Suddenly, a loud sound came from the hallway. The sound of a metal shield hitting a stone pillar was sharp and clear. Nefret stood up quickly. You must go. She whispered. The guards come here every evening to check the temple. If they find you with me, they will ask many questions. Kamos stood up and tucked the papyrus into his belt. He had a new clue. The high priest had a secret brother. A man who hated him. A man who loved gold. Nefret pushed a heavy rug away from the floor. Under the rug was a wooden door. Go through here. She whispered. This path leads to the river. It is safe from the guards. Kamos looked at the priestess. Nefret, tell me one more thing. What did Sennefer look like? How can I know it is him if he wears a mask? Nefret touched her own face. He was very similar to Amunher, but his heart was different. He had a small mark on his right hand. It was a scar from a fire when they were boys. It looked like a small, white star. If you see that mark, you see the brother. Kamos thanked her. He and Merit stepped into the dark hole in the floor. They climbed down a short ladder. The air below was cool and smelled of damp earth. They walked through a narrow tunnel. The only light came from a small lamp Merit carried in her hand. The orange flame moved as they walked. Do you think the general is working for the brother? Merit asked. Her voice was quiet in the stone tunnel. Or maybe the brother is the one giving orders to the general. Kamos replied. Sennefer was a man of the temple once. He knows the secrets of the gold. He knows how to move through the halls without a sound. They reached the end of the tunnel. A small door opened onto the muddy bank of the Nile. The sky was now completely dark. The stars were bright, and the moon was high. Kamos looked at the water. He felt a deep sadness for the high priest. Amunher lived his whole life as a man of peace. But his own brother was a man of shadows and greed. The priestess said Sennefer wanted power. Kamos said, if he has the signet ring, he can become the most powerful man in Thebes. He can even try to take the throne from the Pharaoh. We must find where he is hiding. Merit said, the list you found mentions a house near the old canal. That is a place for the poor and the forgotten. It is a perfect place for a man who is supposed to be dead. Kamos nodded. He felt the weight of the papyrus scroll in his belt. We will go there tomorrow morning. But tonight, we need a place to rest. We cannot go back to the House of Life. The guards are everywhere. They walked along the riverbank. They found a small, empty shed used by the farmers to store grain. It was dry and safe. They sat on the soft straw and looked out at the dark water. Kamos thought about the high priest's face. He remembered the cold touch of the priest's skin. The mystery is like a puzzle. Kamos whispered. Every piece we find shows a darker picture. The brother, the general, the poison, and the gold. They are all connected by a single thread of hate. Merit put her hand on his. We will find the truth. Kamos. The Pharaoh gave you 3 days. We still have time. Kamos closed his eyes. But he did not sleep well. In his dreams, he saw a man with a white star on his hand. The man was holding a golden hawk, and his eyes were full of fire. The shadow of the brother was growing longer with every hour. The sun was a bright yellow circle in the sky when Kamos and Merit woke up. The straw in the shed was dry and itchy, but they were glad to be safe. They walked quickly toward the northern part of the great temple. This was the location of the Library of Life. It was a special place where the records of every important family in Thebes were kept. We need to know more about Sennefer. Kamos whispered as they walked. If he is the older brother, he might think the temple belongs to him. That is a very dangerous thought. The Library of Life was a tall building with thick walls. It stayed very cool inside, even when the desert was hot. Kamos knew the librarian, an old man named Taha. But when they reached the entrance, the large wooden chair where Taha usually sat was empty. The room was silent. Kamos felt a small spark of worry. In the library, silence was normal, but an empty chair was not. Stay near the door. Merit. Kamos said. I know where the family scrolls are kept. Kamos walked into the deep part of the library. The air smelled of old papyrus and cedar oil. He passed many rows of wooden shelves. He reached the section for families of the Great Temple. He looked for a box with the mark of the hawk. This was the family of the high priest. He found the box on a high shelf. It was made of dark wood and had a heavy lid. Kamos pulled the box down and placed it on a stone table. He opened the lid. Inside were several scrolls tied with red and gold string. He took the oldest scroll and opened it carefully. The writing was very old, but Kamos was a scribe and could read it easily. He saw the name of the high priest's father. Below that, he saw two names. The first name was Senefer. The second name was Amunha. He was the first son. Kamos whispered to himself. In Egypt, the first son usually takes the father's job. But next to Senefer's name, someone had written a note in dark ink. It said, "Sent away for the crime of theft. He is no longer a son of this house." Kamos looked at the dates. Senefer was sent away 20 years ago. He was a young man then. He had tried to steal from the temple even as a boy. Kamos felt a cold chill. This meant Senefer had 20 years to grow his anger. He looked for a newer scroll in the box. He wanted to see if anyone had added more information recently. He found a small piece of papyrus that was not tied with string. It looked like it was put there in a hurry. It was a drawing of a house. It was a large house with a garden and a private dock on the river. Below the drawing were the words, "The House of the Canal." This is the same place from the other list. Kamos thought. He was about to show it to Merit when he heard a noise. It was the sound of a heavy metal lock moving in a door at the back of the room. Kamos quickly rolled up the scroll and put the box back on the shelf. He ran back toward the entrance, but he saw that Merit was already gone from the door. Kamos stood still in the middle of the library. His heart was hitting his ribs like a drum. "Merit," he whispered. His voice was thin and shaky. There was no answer. The library was a place of ghosts and silence. He walked back toward the entrance, but the large stone doorway was empty. The morning sun shone on the floor, but Merit was not there. He saw something on the ground near the door. It was a small piece of grey linen. It was a torn part of the scarf Merit wore to hide her face. Kamos picked it up. The cloth felt rough in his hand. He knew then that someone had taken her. They had been quiet and fast. Kamos ran back to the shelf where he found the family records. He wanted to take the box with him. He reached for the high shelf, but his hands found only empty space. The dark wooden box with the mark of the hawk was gone. Someone had taken it in the few moments he was looking at the door. "No," Kamos said. He felt a wave of cold anger. They are trying to hide the past. He heard a low, muffled sound from behind a stack of large papyrus rolls. He moved the heavy scrolls aside. He found Taha, the old librarian. Taha was an adult with white hair and a kind face, but now his face was full of pain. His hands and feet were tied with thick hemp rope. A piece of cloth was tied around his mouth. Kamos quickly untied the old man. Taha breathed deeply and rubbed his red wrists. They came from the shadows. Taha said. His voice was weak. 2 men in the uniforms of the temple guards. But they were not guards. They had the eyes of killers. They took the woman, and they took the records of the high priest's family. Which way did they go? Kamos asked. He helped the old man stand up. They went through the back garden. Taha replied. They said the general wanted the past to stay buried. They said no one is allowed to know about the brother. Kamos looked at the empty shelf. The killers were erasing every piece of proof. They had the signet ring, they had the gold, and now they were taking the people who knew the truth. But Kamos still had the drawing of the house in his mind. He remembered the shape of the garden and the private dock near the old canal. "Taha, you must hide," Kamos said. "Go to the house of the stone carver on the west bank. It is the only safe place left." Kamos stepped out of the library. He did not have merit, and he did not have the scrolls. He was alone in the great city. He felt small against the power of General Hapu and the mysterious brother. But he knew where the house was. He knew where they were taking merit. He had to go to the old canal before the sun went down. The mystery was no longer about gold or laws. It was about saving his friend. Kamos walked with his head down. He tried to look like a man with no purpose, but his heart was racing. The city of Thebes felt like a trap. Every guard he saw looked like a potential enemy. He followed the winding streets toward the southern edge of the city, where the old canal branched off from the great Nile. The canal was a place of stagnant water and tall, drying reeds. The houses here were old and crumbling, built by people who had been forgotten by the palace. The air was thick with the smell of mud and salt. Kamos reached the spot where the canal turned sharply toward a group of high stone walls. He saw it. The house from the drawing. It was much larger than the other buildings in the area. It had a private dock that reached into the dark water of the canal. 2 large, black-painted boats were tied there. They were empty now, but they were the kind of boats used to move heavy cargo, like boxes of gold. Kamos hid behind a pile of broken mud bricks. He watched the house. The windows were small and high, like the eyes of a fortress. There were 2 guards at the main gate. They did not wear the white and gold of the temple. They wore dark, simple tunics and carried curved swords. These were mercenaries, men who fought for whoever had the most gold. Suddenly, a side door opened. A man walked out. He was tall and moved with the confidence of a soldier. Even from a distance, Kamos could see the long, pale line of a scar on his left arm. It was General Hapu. He was talking to a man in a hooded cloak. "Is she secured?" the general asked. His voice carried across the quiet water. "Yes, General," the hooded man replied. "She is in the lower cellar. She refuses to speak, but she will talk when the sun goes down. No one ignores the breath of Apep for long." Kamos felt a cold shiver. They were going to use the poison on merit. He looked at the high walls. There was no way to get past the guards at the gate. He looked at the canal. The water was dark and dirty, but it led right to the private dock. He waited until the general and the hooded man went back inside. Then, he slipped into the water. It was cold and tasted of silt, but he stayed low, moving through the thick reeds. He swam silently toward the back of the house. He reached the wooden pillars of the dock. He pulled himself up, his wet clothes heavy and cold. Above him, a small wooden window was slightly open. It was a window to the kitchens. He could hear the clinking of copper pots and the sound of men laughing inside. He had no weapon. He had no plan. He only had the memory of Merit's face and the knowledge that the 3rd day was almost over. He climbed the wooden post, his fingers slipping on the wet wood, until he reached the ledge. He was inside the lion's den. Kamos dropped silently onto the dirt floor of the kitchen. The room was hot and smelled of roasted meat and heavy spices. He hid behind a large clay vat used for storing beer. 2 servants were busy at a wooden table across the room, arguing about a burnt loaf of bread. They didn't notice the wet scribe shivering in the shadows. Kamos moved toward a narrow stone staircase in the corner of the room. It led down, away from the light of the kitchen fires. He remembered the hooded man's words. The lower cellar. He stepped onto the stairs, his bare feet making no sound on the cool stone. The air grew colder and damper as he descended. At the bottom of the stairs was a long, dark hallway with thick wooden doors. He heard a soft, rhythmic sound, the sound of someone breathing heavily. He followed it to the last door on the left. A small bronze slide bolt was the only thing keeping the door shut. He slid the bolt back slowly, praying it wouldn't creak. He pushed the door open. The room was tiny and lit by a single, sputtering candle. Merritt was sitting on the floor, her hands tied to a heavy iron ring in the wall. Her face was pale, and her eyes were closed, but she looked up when the door opened. "Kamos," she whispered, her voice cracking. How did you find me?" "I'll tell you later," Kamos said, rushing to her side. He didn't have a knife, but he found a sharp piece of flint on the floor. He began to saw through the thick hemp ropes around her wrists. "We have to go. General Hapu is upstairs, and he's not alone. The brother is here," Merritt said, her eyes wide with urgency. "I saw him. Kamos. He doesn't wear the mask in the cellar. It's Sennefer. He looks exactly like the high priest, but his eyes are full of madness. He's the one who wanted the breath of Apep. He wanted his brother to die in pain." As the last strand of rope snapped, a heavy shadow fell across the doorway. "A touching reunion," a cold, smooth voice said. Kamos spun around. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like a ghost of the dead high priest. He wore a fine linen robe, but on his right hand, a white star-shaped scar shone in the candlelight. Behind him stood General Hapu, his hand resting on the hilt of his curved sword. "You are a very persistent scribe," Sennefer said, stepping into the room. He held a small blue vial. "The poison. My brother always said you were the most observant of his servants. It is a pity that your observation skills led you to your grave." Hapu stepped forward, the metal of his armor clinking. "Give me the list. Kamos. I know you found it in the garden. Give it to me, and perhaps the healer lives." Kamos looked at Merritt, then back at the two powerful men. He felt the weight of the papyrus in his belt, the only proof that could save the city. He realized that running was no longer an option. He had to use the only weapon a scribe had: his mind. Kamos stood tall, even though his knees felt like water. He reached into his belt and slowly pulled out the papyrus list. General Hapu's eyes went to the document like a hawk to a mouse. Sennefer, however, kept his gaze on Kamos's face, a cruel smile twisting his lips, a mirror image of the man Kamos had respected for years. "You want the proof?" Kamos asked, his voice echoing in the small stone room. "It is all here. The names of the guards you bought, the merchants who melted the stolen gold, and your own name, General, at the very top." Hapu stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Give it to me, boy, and I might let you run back to your library. Stay here, and you become nothing but a footnote in history." "Don't listen to him, Hapu," Sennefer interrupted, his voice like sliding silk. "He is a scribe. He knows that once we have that paper, he is useless. He is trying to buy time." Sennefer raised the blue vial of poison. "He dies. The healer dies. And the list burns." Kamos looked at Hapu. "General, you are a soldier of Egypt. You fought for the Pharaoh. Do you really believe this man will let you live? He killed his own brother, a high priest, to get what he wanted. What is a general to a man who would kill his own blood?" Hapu's hand hesitated. A flicker of doubt crossed his scarred face. He looked at Sennefer, then back at Kamos. For a moment, the tension in the room was so thick it felt like the stone walls were closing in. "The scribe is right about one thing, Hapu," Sennefer said, his eyes turning cold. "The truth is a dangerous thing. Only those who can control it deserve to live." Suddenly, a loud, thunderous sound erupted from the floor above. It was the sound of wood splintering and the heavy, metallic ring of dozens of spears hitting the floor. Shouts filled the kitchen. "The Medjay!" Hapu hissed, drawing his sword. "The Pharaoh's elite guard." "How?" Senefer snarled, his face contorting in rage. Kamos smiled, a small, weary smile. I didn't just find a house, Senefer. When I spoke to Taha at the library, I told him to go to the stone carver. But first, I told him to leave a trail of ink droplets from the library to the canal. A librarian knows how to leave a mark that only a scribe or a guard would notice. The cellar door was kicked open. A flood of light and soldiers poured in, led by a man in polished bronze armor. Behind them stood the royal vizier, holding the very same grey scarf Kamos had found earlier. Senefer lunged toward Kamos, the blue vial open and ready to throw. But Hapu, in a final moment of soldierly instinct, or perhaps survival, stepped in the way, his heavy shield catching the vial. The blue glass shattered against the bronze, the breath of Apep hissing as it touched the metal, sending up that terrible, bitter smoke. The guards swarmed the room. Within seconds, Hapu and Senefer were pinned against the damp stone walls. The vizier stepped forward, looking at the two men with disgust. General Hapu, Senefer of the House of the Hawk. The vizier said solemnly, "The Pharaoh has heard the whispers. Today, the shadows are brought into the light." Kamos sank to the floor, finally letting go of the list as a guard cut Merit's remaining bonds. The third day was not yet over, and the sun was setting on the conspirators. The great hall of the palace was filled with the light of 1,000 oil lamps. The air was cool and smelled of fresh incense. The Pharaoh sat upon his golden throne, his face as still as a statue. Before him stood Kamos and Merit, their clothes still dusty and stained from the canal, but their heads held high. In heavy bronze chains, General Hapu and Senefer were led into the center of the room. The silence was so deep that the clinking of their chains sounded like thunder. The royal vizier stepped forward and placed the golden signet ring and the list of names onto a small cedar table. "My Pharaoh," the vizier announced. "The scribe Kamos and the healer Merit have uncovered a rot at the heart of the temple. The high priest Amunha was murdered not by an enemy from without, but by a shadow from within." The Pharaoh looked at Senefer. "You would kill your own blood for gold?" Senefer said nothing. He looked only at the floor, the white star-shaped scar on his hand a permanent mark of his betrayal. General Hapu, however, looked at Kamos with a mix of respect and hatred. "The boy is a better soldier than I was, Pharaoh." Hapu rumbled. "He used the truth as a spear." The Pharaoh nodded slowly. He stood up, his royal robes shimmering. "The justice of Marat is balance. For the crime of murder and the theft of the god's wealth, Senefer and Hapu shall be sent to the furthest quarries of the south. They shall spend the rest of their days carving the stone they tried to steal. Their names shall be erased from the records of Thebes." He then turned to Kamos and Merit. A small, rare smile touched his lips. "And for the scribe who saw what others missed, and the healer who spoke for the silent dead, you are rewarded. Kamos, you are no longer a junior scribe. You shall be the chief archivist of the great temple. Merit, the House of Life shall receive 10 bars of gold to build a new wing for the poor." The next morning, Kamos stood on the balcony of the Hall of Records. The sun was rising over the Nile, turning the water into a ribbon of liquid gold. He felt the weight of the new bronze seal at his belt, his new badge of office. Merit walked up beside him, carrying 2 cups of cool mint tea. "Chief Archivist," she teased, bumping her shoulder against his. "Does the new title come with more work or just more dust?" Kamos laughed, a genuine, light sound. "Both, I suspect. But the records are clean now. The story of Amunha ends with the truth, not a lie." He looked out over the city. The mystery was solved, the 3 days were over, and for the first time in a week, the air felt light. He was a man of books and ink, but he had learned that sometimes the most important stories aren't written on papyrus. They are lived in the shadows. "What now?" Merit asked, looking at the horizon. Kamos took a sip of his tea and smiled. "Now, I think I'll write a book." Not a law, and not a list. A story about a cat statue, a blue poison, and a friend who wouldn't let me go into the dark alone. The dust had settled on the trial of General Hapu, but Kamos could not shake a lingering feeling of unease. He sat in his new office as Chief Archivist, surrounded by the smell of cedar and old papyrus, yet his eyes kept drifting to the family records of the House of the Hawk. Specifically, he looked at the date of Senefer's supposed death 20 years ago. According to the temple scrolls, Senefer had died in a desert storm after being exiled. If he died in the desert, there must be a grave. Kamos whispered to himself. He reached for a map of the western necropolis, the city of the dead. Even exiled men were sometimes given a small, nameless pit to mark their passing from this world to the next. He found Merit in the new wing of the House of Life. She was busy organizing jars of honey and linen bandages, but she stopped when she saw the look on Kamos's face. It was the look he got when a piece of a puzzle didn't fit. "The trial is over, Kamos," she said softly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Senefer is in the quarries. Why do you look like you've seen a ghost again?" "Because I think we buried a lie 20 years ago," Kamos replied. "I searched the exile records. There is a tomb marked for a nameless traveler in the Valley of the Falcons. The date matches the day Senefer was sent away. If we find that grave, we might find what he was hiding before he ever returned to Thebes." Merit sighed, but she began packing her bag with a small bronze lantern and a flask of water. She knew Kamos wouldn't rest until every word in his archives was true. They traveled to the Valley of the Falcons as the sun began its descent. It was a lonely, wind-swept place where the sand moved like liquid gold between the jagged rocks. After an hour of searching, they found it, a small, low entrance carved into the base of a cliff. There were no statues, no paintings of the gods, only a single mark, a hawk with broken wings. Kamos pushed against the stone slab that covered the entrance. It was surprisingly light. With Merit's help, the stone slid aside. The air that rushed out was not the dry, stale air of a tomb. It was cool and smelled of the open desert. They stepped inside, Merit's lantern casting long, flickering shadows. The tomb was empty. There was no sarcophagus, no jars of food for the afterlife. Instead, the floor was covered in discarded linen and broken pottery. In the center of the small room was a stone table. Kamos moved the lantern closer. Carved into the surface of the stone table was a map of the Nile, stretching far to the south, beyond the borders of Egypt into the land of Cush. A single point was marked with a deep red stain. "This wasn't a grave, Merit," Kamos said, his voice echoing in the small chamber. "This was a hiding place. Senefer didn't die 20 years ago. He was building something. And look at this." He pointed to a small, hidden compartment at the base of the table. Inside was a single object, a silver seal, identical in shape to the pharaoh's own, but instead of the royal name, it bore the image of a serpent eating its own tail. The conspirators in Thebes were just the beginning. Merit whispered, "The real power isn't in the palace. It's in the south." Kamos held the silver seal in the palm of his hand. It felt unusually heavy, almost as if the metal itself was burdened by the secret it represented. The image of the serpent eating its own tail was a symbol he had seen only once before, in a dusty, forbidden scroll kept in the deepest cellar of the Library of Life. It represented eternity, but not the golden eternity of the gods. It was the eternal cycle of shadows and chaos. "This is the mark of the Apep Slayers," Kamos whispered, his breath hitching in the cool air of the tomb. "An ancient cult that believed Egypt must be destroyed and reborn from the ashes of the desert. We thought they vanished during the reign of the old kings." Merit leaned over the stone table, her fingers tracing the red-stained mark on the map. "The south," she said, her voice steady despite the darkness. "The land of the bow. If Senefer was part of this, he wasn't just stealing gold to be rich. He was funding an army." Kamos, Look at where this mark is. It's near the second cataract, deep in the territory where the Pharaoh's reach begins to fade. Before Kamos could respond, a soft, scraping sound echoed from the entrance of the tomb. It wasn't the sound of the wind or a shifting sand dune. It was the sound of a leather sandal stepping on grit. Kamos quickly blew out the small bronze lantern. The chamber was plunged into a darkness so thick it felt like physical weight. He grabbed Merit's arm and pulled her behind the stone table. They stayed perfectly still, their hearts beating in a frantic, uneven rhythm. A sliver of moonlight cut through the opening of the tomb. A shadow moved across the floor, long, thin, and silent. A man stepped into the chamber. He didn't carry a spear or a sword. Instead, he held a long, curved staff topped with the head of a cobra. He moved with a strange, swaying grace, sniffed the air like a predator, and stopped near the stone table. "I know you are here, little scribe," the man said. His voice was a raspy hiss, like dry papyrus being rubbed together. "The general was a fool to let you live. He saw only the gold. We see the truth of the world." Kamos felt Merit's hand tighten on his sleeve. He knew they couldn't stay hidden for long. He reached into his belt and found the heavy silver seal. Using all his strength, he threw it toward the far corner of the room. It hit the stone wall with a loud, ringing crack. The stranger spun around, his staff raised. In that split second, Kamos grabbed the heavy stone slab they had used as a door and shoved it with his shoulder. It didn't close the entrance, but it knocked over a stack of old pottery jars, creating a cloud of dust and a deafening noise. "Run!" Kamos shouted. He and Merit bolted for the narrow opening. They scrambled out into the night air, the cool desert wind hitting their faces. Behind them, they heard the stranger let out a low, guttural chant. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate. They didn't look back. They ran across the dunes, the moonlight guiding their way toward the distant lights of Thebes. But as they ran, Kamos realized the silver seal was still in that room, and he had just shown the cult exactly who was hunting them. The mystery had shifted. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. Kamos and Merit did not stop running until the towering limestone walls of Thebes rose before them like protective giants. The city gates were closed for the night, but Kamos, now the Chief Archivist, carried the bronze seal of his office. He pressed it into the hand of the startled gate guard, who moved the heavy wooden beams just enough for them to slip through. The streets of Thebes were silent, the air heavy with the scent of river mud and blooming jasmine. But the beauty of the night felt like a mask. Every shadow in a doorway looked like the man with the cobra staff. Every rustle of palm leaves sounded like a hissed threat. "We have to go to the palace," Kamos whispered, his lungs still burning from the desert air. "The vizier needs to know that the snake has more than one head." They reached the vizier's private quarters in the inner palace. The vizier, an elderly man named Rekmire, was known for his sharp mind and his long nights spent over tax scrolls and judicial reports. He was startled to see the two young people arrive at such an hour, their clothes torn and their faces streaked with desert dust. "Kamos! Merit! What has happened?" the vizier asked, rising from his ebony chair. "I thought the matter of the high priest was settled." "It was only the beginning, my lord," Kamos said. He quickly described the empty tomb, the map to the south, and the man with the serpent staff. When Kamos mentioned the symbol of the serpent eating its own tail, the vizier's hand shook, spilling a few drops of dark wine onto his white linen robe. He sat back down heavily, his face turning the color of weathered bone. "The Order of the Eternal Serpent," Rekmire whispered, his voice trembling. "I have not heard that name since I was a young scribe in the service of the old Pharaoh. They are not merely thieves, Kamos. They are fanatics. They believe that the order of the world, the Marat we serve, is a lie. They wish to return Egypt to the darkness that existed before the first sunrise." The map in the tomb showed a point near the second cataract. Merit added, Senefer was funding them with the temple gold. If he was sent into exile 20 years ago, how did he survive? How did he build this power without the palace knowing? The vizier looked at the flickering oil lamps on the wall. It means there is a traitor higher than General Hapu. He said grimly. Hapu was a soldier. He followed orders. Senefer was a priest. He followed a vision. But someone provided the ships, the food, and the silence required to hide an army in the south for 2 decades. The vizier leaned forward, his eyes sharp with a new, cold fear. You have touched a hornet's nest, Kamos. The man you saw in the tomb was likely a shadow speaker, a high priest of the cult. They do not forgive, and they do not forget. If they know you have seen the map, you are no longer safe in Thebes. What do we do? Kamos asked. You must go south. The vizier said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Not as officials, but as travelers. If I send an army, the traitors in the palace will warn the cult, and they will vanish into the desert. But a scribe and a healer. You can move through the river towns unnoticed. You must find where that gold is going before the serpent strikes at the heart of the throne. He reached into a hidden drawer in his desk and pulled out a small leather pouch filled with gold rings. Take this, and take my swiftest river galley. You leave before the sun touches the horizon. The pre-dawn light was a bruise-colored purple as Kamos and Merit reached the royal docks. The air was heavy with the scent of damp reeds and the cold, metallic smell of the Nile. Waiting for them was the silver ibis, a slender, fast river galley built of fine Lebanese cedar. Unlike the heavy grain barges that clogged the river, this ship was built for speed and silence. Its single large sail was furled, and its 20 oars were tucked in like the legs of a resting insect. The captain was a short, barrel-chested man named Pharaoh. He had skin the color of dark mahogany and eyes that seemed to have seen every sandbar and crocodile between Thebes and the Great Cataract. He didn't ask for their names or their business. The vizier's seal on the parchment Kamos carried was the only conversation he required. Get aboard. Pharaoh grunted, gesturing with a calloused hand toward the small cabin at the stern. The wind is coming from the north. If we move now, we can clear the city limits before the sun is high enough for the tax collectors to bother us. Kamos stepped onto the deck, feeling the unfamiliar roll of the wood beneath his feet. He was a man of stone floors and steady tables. The river felt alive, a giant, shifting muscle that could swallow a man and his secrets without a ripple. Merit followed him, her bag of medicines clinking softly. She looked back at the silhouette of the great temple, its massive pylons cutting a dark, jagged line against the waking sky. We are leaving everything behind. She whispered, her voice barely audible over the lapping water. My patience, your library, the safety of the Pharaoh's shadow. We are carrying the Pharaoh's shadow with us. Kamos replied, though he didn't feel nearly as confident as he sounded. He adjusted the leather strap of his scroll case. Inside, he had packed blank papyrus, charcoal, and the stolen map he had memorized before the shadow speaker arrived. If we stay, the serpent eats the heart of Egypt. If we go, we might at least see the fangs coming. As the rowers pushed off, the silver ibis glided into the main channel. The rhythmic thump splash of the oars became the heartbeat of their journey. The lights of Thebes began to fade, twinkling like dying embers in the distance. Kamos stood at the railing, watching the riverbanks. The tall palms and mud-brick villas looked like ghosts in the mist. Suddenly, he stiffened. High on a cliff overlooking the river, near the very tomb they had explored the night before, a single spark of light appeared. It was a torch, waved in a slow, deliberate circle, 3 times. Someone is signaling. Kamos said, pointing toward the cliff. Pharaoh glanced up, his brow furrowing. He spat into the water. Signals are for soldiers and thieves, Scribe. And we aren't carrying any soldiers. He barked an order to the rowers to double their pace. The silver ibis surged forward, cutting through the mist. Kamos realized with a sinking heart that their secret departure was likely known to the Order before they had even stepped onto the docks. They weren't just traveling south to find a cult. They were leading the cult exactly where it wanted them to go. The silver ibis carved through the water like a bronze blade. For the first 2 days, the river was their only companion. The green ribbon of the Nile Valley grew thinner, pressed by the encroaching golden sands of the desert. Kamos spent his hours at a small makeshift desk on deck, recording the landmarks they passed: the high cliffs of Jebel el-Silsila, the distant pylons of Edfu, and the strange, haunting cries of the birds that followed their wake. By the 3rd morning, the heat had become a physical weight. The sun was a relentless eye, watching them from a sky so blue it looked like polished lapis. Captain Paheri ordered the men to pull into a small, sheltered cove near a ruined outpost. "We need fresh water." The captain grunted, wiping sweat from his thick neck. "There's an old well here, used by the desert patrols. It's better than the silt-heavy river water for the rowers." Kamos and Merritt stepped onto the shore. The sand was hot enough to burn through their sandals. The outpost was a crumbling ruin of mud bricks, its walls half buried by the shifting dunes. Merritt, always cautious, knelt by the well as the sailors prepared their clay jars. "Wait," she said, her voice sharp. She sniffed the air near the mouth of the well. "Don't lower the buckets yet." Kamos walked over, peering into the dark circle of the well. "What is it, Merritt? Is it the breath of Apep?" "No," she whispered, her brow furrowed. She dipped a small linen strip into the water and pulled it out. The cloth didn't turn black, but it shimmered with an oily, iridescent film. "This is different. It smells of copper and bitter oleander. It's not meant to kill instantly. It's meant to weaken, to make the blood thin and the heart slow." The sailors looked at each other, their faces pale. If they had drunk this water, they would have been unable to row within a day. They would have been stranded in the middle of the desert, easy prey for whoever was following them. Kamos looked around the ruins. He noticed a set of fresh tracks in the sand, leading away from the well and toward a cluster of rocks further inland. The tracks were strange, not the flat print of a sandal, but a series of small, rhythmic indentations, as if something heavy had been dragged, or a staff had been used for every step. The shadow speaker. Kamos realized. He didn't just signal from the cliffs. He moved ahead of us. "But how?" Merritt asked. "We have the fastest galley on the Nile. The desert has its own paths," Paheri said, joining them. He drew a short, curved bronze knife. "Paths the river doesn't see. If they are poisoning the wells, they aren't trying to hide anymore. They are trying to stop us before we reach the cataract." Kamos looked back at the silver ibis. It looked small and vulnerable against the vast, empty horizon. He realized that the Order wasn't just a group of fanatics. They were masters of the land itself. Every oasis, every well, and every shade tree could be a trap. "We don't take the water," Kamos ordered, his voice taking on a new authority. "We drink the river water, silt and all. We don't stop again until we reach Elephantine." As they boarded the ship, Kamos caught sight of something glinting in the rocks. It was a small silver scale, shaped like the skin of a serpent, pinned to a thorn bush. It was a warning. The serpent wasn't just in the south. It was already coiled around their path. The silver ibis slowed its pace as the island of Elephantine appeared on the horizon. The island sat in the middle of the Nile like a giant granite fortress, surrounded by massive, smooth boulders that looked like the grey backs of elephants bathing in the current. This was the edge of the world for many Egyptians, the gateway to the south and the place where the Nile's inundation was said to begin. The air here was different than in Thebes. It was thinner, sharper, and filled with the sounds of a dozen different languages. Traders from the distant lands of Kush, wearing leopard skins and gold earrings, bartered with Egyptian tax collectors in pleated linen. The scent of exotic spices, cinnamon, frankincense, and myrrh, clashed with the smell of drying fish and river mud. "We must find the Nilometer," Kamos said, adjusting his belt. "The vizier told me that the keeper of the records here, a man named Kamos, is one of the few who cannot be bought. If the gold from the temple passed through here, he will have a mark of it." The Nilometer was a series of stone steps leading down into the river, used to measure the height of the Nile's yearly flood. Kamos' office was a small, shaded room built directly into the cliffside above the steps. When Kamos and Merit entered, they found an old man whose skin was as wrinkled and dark as a dried plum. He was meticulously cleaning a reed pen. "Chief Archivist Kamos," Kamos said without looking up. "The news of your appointment reached the border faster than the river flows. The desert wind carries many whispers." "Then the wind must have told you why we are here, Kamos," Kamos replied, stepping into the cool shade. The old man looked up then, his eyes milky with age but sharp with intelligence. He gestured for them to sit on simple reed mats. "You seek the silent cargo. For 3 months, black-sailed ships have passed Elephantine in the dead of night. They do not stop for the tax collectors. They do not signal the fort. They move like ghosts. And you let them pass?" Merit asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I am a recorder of water, child, not a general of armies," Kamos said with a touch of dry wit. "But I record what I see. Those ships were low in the water, heavy with metal, and they were led by a man who didn't have a face. He wore a mask of silver, shaped like a serpent." Kamos felt the silver ibis seal in his pocket grow cold. "Senefer," he whispered. "He is no longer just a ghost from the past." Kamos continued. "He has taken over the Quarry of the Sun, a few miles south of the First Cataract. It was supposed to be closed years ago because the stone was too soft, but there is smoke rising from its chimneys every night. They aren't carving stone there, Kamos. They are forging something." Suddenly, a shadow blocked the light of the doorway. A tall, muscular man with a shaved head and tattoos of hunting dogs across his chest stood there. He was a Medjay scout, but he didn't wear the official collar of the Pharaoh's guard. "Kamos," the man growled. "The master asks if the water levels are rising." The old scribe didn't flinch. "The water is steady. Sabni, tell your master to watch the river, not my office." The man's eyes shifted to Kamos and Merit. He lingered on Kamos's official scribe's pallet. With a grunt, he turned and vanished back into the bustling market. "You must leave now," Kamos whispered urgently. "Sabni is the eyes of the serpent in this city. If he sees you again, the river will be your only grave. Take the path behind the temple. It leads to the high rocks. You can watch the quarry from there before you commit your lives to the flame." The path behind the Temple of Knum was steep and treacherous, carved directly into the sun-scorched granite of the cliffs. Kamos and Merit climbed in silence, their breaths coming in short, hot gasps. The wind here was different. It didn't carry the moisture of the river, but the dry, stinging bite of the deep desert. As they reached the summit of the ridge, the world opened up before them in a landscape of jagged shadows and shimmering heat. Below them lay the Quarry of the Sun. In the time of the old kings, this place had provided the pink granite for the great obelisks, but it had long been abandoned to the scorpions and the sand. Now, however, it hummed with an unnatural, feverish energy. Hundreds of workers moved like ants in the deep pit, but they were not swinging the heavy diorite balls used to pound stone. Instead, they were tending to massive clay furnaces built into the side of the cliff. Thick, greasy black smoke billowed from the chimneys, staining the pristine blue of the sky. "They aren't quarrying," Kamos whispered, pressing his body against the hot rock to stay out of sight. He pulled a small bronze looking glass from his pack, a tool usually used by architects to check the alignment of temple walls. They are smelting, on a scale I've never seen. Merit looked through the glass next. Her eyes widened. Kamos, look at the color of the slag. It's not copper or bronze. It's too bright. Kamos took the glass back and focused on a group of men near the central furnace. They were pouring molten metal into long, rectangular molds. Even from this distance, the liquid glowed with a distinct, buttery yellow hue. The temple gold. Kamos said, his heart sinking. They aren't just hiding it. They are alloying it with bronze. Gold-plated weapons. In the sun, an army carrying those would look like the gods themselves descending from the sky. It's a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Suddenly, a rhythmic drumming started from the center of the quarry. A group of men in dark robes, their faces painted with white serpent scales, emerged from a cavern at the base of the pit. They carried a golden palanquin, and atop it sat a figure draped in shimmering silver. The man wore the mask of the serpent that Kamos had described, a terrifying visage of polished silver with emeralds for eyes. The workers dropped to their knees, their hammers falling silent. The man in the silver mask stood and raised his right hand. Even from the ridge, the white star-shaped scar on his hand was visible as it caught the direct light of the midday sun. Senefer. Merit breathed, her voice trembling. He's not just their leader. He's their god. Senefer began to speak, his voice amplified by the natural bowl of the quarry. He spoke of the end of the great cycle. Of the day the Nile would run red, and the Pharaoh's throne would crumble into the sand. He promised the workers that the gold they forged today would buy them a place in the new world that would rise from the ruins of Thebes. As the workers cheered, a movement caught Kamos's eye. A group of Medjay scouts, the ones they had seen in Elephantine, were beginning to circle the perimeter of the ridge. They weren't looking down into the quarry. They were looking up, toward the very rocks where Kamos and Merit were hiding. They know we're here. Kamos hissed, grabbing Merit's hand. The scout from the market. He must have tracked us. They scrambled backward, but the ridge was narrow, and the only way down was the way they had come, right into the arms of the approaching scouts. The sound of leather sandals hitting stone was getting louder. Kamos and Merit backed away from the edge of the ridge, but the slope was too steep to climb and the path back to the temple was blocked. To their left was a sheer drop into the quarry. To their right, a jagged wall of black granite. The old vents. Kamos whispered, his eyes scanning the rock face. In the Old Kingdom, they didn't just dig pits. They carved shafts to let the heat out of the deep tunnels. If we can find one, we can drop below the ridge line. Merit pointed to a small, dark opening partially hidden by a cluster of dry thorn bushes. There. But it's narrow. Kamos. If we get stuck. It beats meeting the Medjay's spears. Kamos replied. They scrambled toward the opening just as the first scout rounded the corner of the path. The man let out a sharp whistle, a signal to his companions. Kamos shoved Merit into the narrow hole first, then squeezed in behind her, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air inside was stifling, smelling of ancient dust and the faint, metallic tang of the smelting fires below. They slid down a smooth, angled shaft. It wasn't a vertical drop, but a steep incline that deposited them onto a ledge inside a massive, hollowed-out cavern. Below them, the quarry workers were no longer visible, but the roar of the furnaces was deafening. This was the heart of the operation, the lower forge. From their vantage point, Kamos could see rows upon rows of bronze shields being dipped into vats of molten gold. It was a factory of war, but more terrifying than the weapons were the men. These weren't just common criminals or slaves. Among the workers were men wearing the distinct leather kilts of the Libyan mercenaries and the feathered headpieces of the sea peoples. Senefer wasn't just building an army, he was building a coalition of Egypt's greatest enemies. He's going to attack during the festival of Opit. Merit whispered, her eyes wide as she watched a group of men practice drills with the gold-plated spears. The city will be full of people, the guards will be distracted by the parade, and the Pharaoh will be out in the open. We have to get back to the Silver Ibis. Kamos said, if we can reach the river, we can get word to the vizier before the festival begins. They began to creep along the ledge, looking for an exit that led toward the riverbank. But as they turned a corner into a smaller side chamber, they stopped dead. The chamber was filled with hundreds of small clay jars, each sealed with red wax and marked with the sign of the serpent. One of the jars had fallen and shattered. A thick, dark blue liquid had leaked out, turning the stone beneath it a bruised purple. The breath of Apep. Kamos breathed. He doesn't just have an army. He has enough poison to kill everyone in the palace. He's not going to fight a war. Merit. He's going to commit a massacre. Suddenly, the floor beneath them vibrated. A heavy stone door at the end of the chamber began to grind open. Kamos looked around frantically for a place to hide, but the room was filled with nothing but the deadly jars. A voice, cold and familiar, drifted into the room as the door opened wide. The scent of fear is quite distinct, isn't it? Sabni. It smells like ink and old papyrus. Senefer stepped into the room, his silver mask removed and hanging from his belt. His face, so like the dead high priest's, was twisted into a mask of cruel amusement. Behind him stood the scout from the market, his spear leveled at Kamos's chest. Welcome to the end of your story, Chief Archivist, Senefer said. Senefer stepped into the center of the chamber, his footsteps echoing like slow, deliberate drumbeats against the stone floor. He looked at Kamos and Merit with a disturbing lack of anger. Instead, there was a cold, intellectual curiosity in his gaze, as if he were a scholar examining two particularly interesting insects trapped in a jar of honey. I must admit, Kamos, Senefer said, his voice smooth and devoid of the rasping hate his followers carried. I underestimated the tenacity of a scribe. Most men of your station are content to hide behind their scrolls while the world burns. You, however, seem determined to be the fuel. Kamos kept his body between Senefer and Merit. He could feel her trembling, but her hand remained steady on the medical bag at her side. You speak of the world burning, Kamos said, his voice surprisingly firm. But you are the one holding the torch. Why? You were the first son of a great house. You could have been the high priest yourself. Senefer laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. High priest. To spend my days washing the feet of a golden statue and begging a silent god for rain. My brother, Amunher, was a fool. He loved the order of the temple more than the power of it. He believed that by serving the Pharaoh, he was serving Egypt. But the Pharaoh is a man of flesh, and men of flesh can be broken. He gestured to the hundreds of jars of the breath of Apep surrounding them. This is not just poison, Kamos. This is the equalizer. It does not care for royal blood or common dirt. When the air in the great hall turns blue during the festival, the old world will suffocate. And from that silence, I will speak a new law. You would kill thousands to sit on a throne of bone. Merit said, her voice filled with disgust. Senefer turned his cold gaze toward her. The healer, always so concerned with the individual life. Tell me, Merit, how many children die of hunger in the shadows of the palace while the Pharaoh eats from plates of solid gold? My order will tear down the walls that keep the light from the poor. By poisoning them. Kamos countered. You aren't a savior, Senefer. You're just a man with a 20-year-old grudge. Senefer's face hardened. The mask of the scholar slipped, revealing the raw, jagged edges of the exile's rage. Enough. Sabni. Take them to the central shaft. They have seen my forge. Now let them see the fire. We will see if their truth protects them when they are thrown into the smelting vat. Sabni stepped forward, the bronze tip of his spear grazing Kamos's chest. But as the guard reached out to grab Kamos's arm, Kamos didn't pull away. Instead, he lunged forward, not toward the guard, but toward the open jar of blue poison on the floor. If we die, we don't die alone. Kamos shouted. He kicked the heavy clay jar with all his might. It didn't just tip. It shattered against a stack of other jars. A massive wave of the blue liquid splashed across the floor, and a thick, acrid cloud of blue smoke began to rise instantly. The mask! Sennefer hissed, scrambling backward toward the stone door. Get the mask! In the chaos of the rising smoke, the guards panicked. They knew the lethality of the breath better than anyone. Sabni turned to run, his fear of the poison greater than his loyalty to the master. Kamos grabbed Merit's hand. Hold your breath. The medical bag, the vinegar. Merit understood instantly. She pulled a small jar of strong vinegar from her bag and soaked a scrap of linen. They pressed the wet cloth to their faces, the acidic sting of the vinegar acting as a crude filter against the rising fumes. Through the blue haze, Kamos saw a small service tunnel used by the furnace boys. This way, he muffled through the cloth. They dove into the darkness of the tunnel just as the chamber behind them became a swirling vortex of lethal blue shadows. The service tunnel was a narrow, jagged throat of stone designed for children, not adults. Kamos and Merit crawled on their bellies, the vinegar-soaked linen pressed hard against their faces. Above them, the rock vibrated with the roar of the great furnaces, and the heat was a physical weight pressing them into the dust. Every breath was a struggle against the phantom sting of the blue poison they had left behind. Keep moving. Kamos muffled into the cloth. The air is clearer ahead. After what felt like an eternity in the suffocating dark, the floor of the tunnel began to slope upward. The stifling heat of the forge was replaced by a sudden, sharp draft of cooler air. They emerged into a small, natural cleft in the rock, hidden by a curtain of dry river reeds. Below them lay the Nile. The water was a deep, bruised purple in the fading light of the sunset. But the peace of the river was gone. The silver ibis was no longer the silent, swift predator of the water. It was surrounded by 3 smaller, black-sailed skiffs. The sound of metal clashing and the shouts of men drifted up to the ridge. Paheri is fighting them off. Merit whispered, her voice raw. She pointed to the deck of the galley, where the captain was swinging a heavy wooden oar like a club, keeping the serpent-masked boarders at bay. We can't get to them. Kamos realized. If we go down there, we'll just be captured on the shore. And if that ship goes down, the message to the vizier dies with it. Kamos looked at the path they had taken. They were high above the river, near a series of massive granite blocks that had been partially cut but left behind centuries ago. One block sat precariously on the edge of the slope, held back only by a rotted wooden frame and a pile of rubble. The stone. Kamos said, his eyes narrowing. Merit, help me with the support beams. What are you doing? She asked, already moving to assist. Creating a distraction. If that block hits the water near those skiffs, the waves will give Paheri the opening he needs to row out into the main channel. They grabbed a heavy discarded pry bar from the quarry's edge. Together, they jammed it under the rotted timber. With a collective heave, the wood groaned and snapped. The massive granite block, weighing several tons, shuddered once, then began to slide. It gathered speed, crashing through the dry brush and small boulders until it hit the water with a sound like a collapsing mountain. The resulting splash sent a wall of water over the black-sailed skiffs. The smaller boats rocked violently, 2 of them nearly capsizing. In the confusion, Paheri shouted a command. The oars of the silver ibis struck the water in a frantic, synchronized rhythm. The galley surged forward, breaking the circle and heading into the deep, fast-moving center of the Nile. Kamos and Merit watched as the silver ibis disappeared into the darkness. They were now truly alone, stranded on the riverbank with the entire Order of the Serpent between them and home. "They are safe," Merit said, though her voice lacked comfort. "But we aren't." Kamos looked back toward the quarry. Torches were moving rapidly toward the river. "Then we don't go by river. We go through the desert. We need to reach the hidden oasis before the moon is high." The silence of the desert was more terrifying than the roar of the furnaces. After the chaos of the quarry, the vast, empty expanse of the Sahara felt like a different world, a world of silver light and long, ink-black shadows. Kamos and Merit moved away from the river, their sandals sinking into the soft, cooling sand of the dunes. "The hidden oasis is 3 hours to the east," Kamos said, his eyes fixed on the northern star. "The old maps in the library call it the Eye of Ather. It was a resting place for the gold caravan centuries ago. But the desert swallowed the road." Merit stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline that had fueled their escape was fading, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "Kamos, we have no water. The vinegar helped us breathe, but it has left my throat feeling like I swallowed hot coals." Kamos looked at her, his heart aching. He had led a healer, a woman dedicated to life, into a place of nothing but death. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small, dried piece of fruit he had saved from the ship. "Chew on this. It will help the moisture." As they climbed the crest of a massive dune, the wind began to pick up. It wasn't the cooling breeze of the Nile. It was a dry, singing wind that carried the fine dust of the deep desert. Kamos stopped and looked back. Far in the distance, near the dark ribbon of the river, he saw a line of flickering lights. "Torches," he whispered. "The Medjay scouts. They aren't giving up. They can't track us in the sand, can they?" Merit asked, her voice trembling. "Not by sight," Kamos replied grimly. "But the Order has the hunting dogs of Kush. Those beasts can smell a drop of sweat across 3 miles of dunes. We have to reach the rocky ground of the oasis before the wind dies down." They pushed forward, the sand becoming a relentless enemy. Every step upward felt like pulling their feet from mud. Kamos kept his gaze on the stars, using the celestial geometry he had studied as a young apprentice to guide their path. He thought of the high priest, Amunha. The old man had known this was coming. He had known his brother was a shadow that could not be outrun. Suddenly, the smell changed. It was faint, a ghost of a scent. But it was there. It wasn't the dry dust of the dunes. It was the smell of wet earth and wild palm leaves. "Look," Merit said, pointing ahead. Below the next ridge, tucked into a deep, rocky bowl, was a cluster of dark shapes. Tall, ancient palms swayed in the wind, their fronds whispering secrets to the moon. In the center of the greenery, a small pool of water reflected the starlight like a polished silver mirror. But as they descended into the oasis, Kamos realized they weren't alone. Near the water's edge sat a small hut made of mud and palm wood. An old man sat in front of a tiny fire, roasting a single fish. He didn't look up as they approached, but his voice was clear and steady. "You are late, Scribe," the old man said. "The stars said you would arrive before the moon reached its peak." Kamos froze. "Who are you?" The old man looked up. His eyes were milky with cataracts, yet he seemed to see right through the darkness. He wore the tattered remnants of a priest's robe, not from the temple of Amun, but from a much older, forgotten house. "I am the keeper of the eye," he replied, "and I have been waiting 20 years for someone to tell me why the desert has turned blue." The old man gestured toward the fire, his movements slow but deliberate. Kamos and Merit approached cautiously, the heat of the small flame a sharp contrast to the biting chill of the desert night. As they sat, The old man handed them a leather skin filled with water. It was cool, sweet, and tasted of deep earth, the most precious thing they had ever felt. "Drink slowly," the hermit warned. "The desert takes much from the body, but it takes more from the soul if you are not careful." "You said you've been waiting 20 years. Kamos said after the water had cleared the dust from his throat. "How did you know we were coming? And how do you know about the blue omen?" The old man, whose name was Userhat, looked into the heart of the fire. 20 years ago, I was a young priest at the Temple of Thoth. I was the one who recorded the exile of Senefer. I saw the look in his eyes when the high priest turned his back. It wasn't the look of a defeated man. It was the look of a man who had finally found his purpose. He leaned forward, the firelight dancing in his clouded eyes. I spoke out. I told the council that sending a man like Senefer into the waste was like throwing a torch into a dry granary. They didn't listen. They stripped me of my title and sent me here to guard this well until the desert claimed me. Senefer has built an army," Merit said, her voice still raspy. "He has gold-plated weapons and a poison that turns the air blue. He calls it the breath of Apep." Userhat nodded slowly. "The blue mist. It is an old recipe, found in the forbidden tombs of the First Dynasty. It is said that Apep, the great serpent of chaos, breathes this smoke to choke the sun as it travels through the underworld. Senefer hasn't just built an army, he has built a ritual." Suddenly, a low, guttural howl echoed from the top of the dunes. It was a sound that made the hair on Kamos's neck stand up, a sound of hunger and ancient malice. "The hunting dogs," Kamos hissed, reaching for his pry bar. "They are close," Userhat said, showing no fear. "The beasts of Kush do not tire, and they do not lose a scent. But even a dog cannot find a trail that is buried in time." The old man stood up and walked toward the small hut. He returned carrying a heavy clay jar filled with a thick, grey powder. "This is the ash of Sekhmet. It is made from crushed minerals found only in the deepest caves of this oasis. It neutralizes any scent, human or otherwise. Rub it on your clothes and your skin." As they began to cover themselves in the fine, cooling ash, the howls grew louder. In the moonlight, Kamos could see the silhouettes of 4 massive creatures standing on the ridge of the dune. They were larger than any desert wolf, with long, powerful limbs and glowing eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural fire. "Go into the water," Userhat commanded. "There is a tunnel behind the waterfall at the back of the pool. It leads to the old caravan road. It is a dangerous path, filled with shifting stones and narrow ledges, but the dogs will not follow you there." "What about you?" Merit asked, looking at the frail old man. Userhat smiled, and for a moment, his milky eyes seemed to clear. "I have stayed at this well for 20 years. Child, I think it is time I finally went to see the sun rise from a different hill. Now, move, before the beasts descend." Kamos and Merit dove into the cool water of the pool. They swam toward the dark shadows behind the small, trickling fall, just as the first of the hunting dogs reached the edge of the firelight. The water was a freezing shock that stole the air from Kamos's lungs. He plunged beneath the small, silver waterfall, his hand gripped tightly around Merit's wrist. For a terrifying moment, there was nothing but churning white foam and the weight of the dark pool. Then, his fingers brushed against a smooth stone ledge hidden behind the curtain of water. He pulled Merit upward into a narrow, vertical fissure. They scrambled out of the pool, gasping for breath, as the muffled howls of the hunting dogs echoed through the rock wall behind them. The air in the tunnel was heavy with the smell of wet limestone and ancient, stagnant dampness. It was a sunless path, carved into the very bones of the desert plateau. "Userhat, do you think he will be all right?" Merit whispered, her voice trembling as she wrung out the hem of her tunic. The ash they had rubbed on their skin had turned into a grey, ghostly mud. Kamos looked back at the flickering light filtered through the waterfall. He chose his stand. Merit. He has been a prisoner of that oasis for 20 years. I think he finally wanted to be a guardian again. He reached into his wet scroll case, relieved to find that the wax-sealed leather had kept his latest notes dry. We have to keep moving. This tunnel is an old aqueduct, built to carry water to the caravans when the mountains were still green. They walked in total darkness, feeling their way along the damp walls. Kamos led the way, his fingers tracing the faint, rhythmic chisel marks of the stonemasons who had died centuries before the first pyramid was even a dream. After nearly an hour of blind walking, the floor began to rise, and the smell of the damp earth was replaced by the sharp, dry scent of the high desert. They emerged into a narrow canyon, its walls so high and close together that only a thin ribbon of starlight was visible above. This was the old caravan road. It wasn't a road in the way the paved streets of Thebes were. It was a secret artery through the mountains, a path that bypassed every official guard post and tax station on the Nile. Look, Kamos said, pointing to the ground. In the soft silt of the canyon floor, there were clear indentations. They weren't from travelers or merchants. They were the wide, heavy tracks of sledges used to transport massive weight. Mixed in with the tracks were the distinct, circular prints of spear butts. The gold. Merit breathed. They didn't just move it by ship. They used this road to bring the finished weapons back toward the city. We are walking right into the serpent's supply line. Kamos knelt and picked up a small, discarded object from the sand. It was a copper nail, twisted and broken, of the type used to reinforce the wheels of a war chariot. They aren't just bringing gold. Merit. They are bringing chariots. If Senefer has a chariot core hidden in the hills above Thebes, the city's infantry won't stand a chance. The Pharaoh's guards are trained for parades and palace walls, not a high-speed charge in the open streets. The gravity of the situation weighed on Kamos more than the mountain above. They were two people on foot, trying to outrun a mechanized army of fanatics. He looked up the long, winding throat of the canyon. We don't go to the river. We follow this road. It will lead us to the Valley of the Kings, right behind the western hills. If we can reach the necropolis, we can find the Medjay who guard the tombs. They are the only ones left who might not be under the general's shadow. The air in the high canyon was thin and cold, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the forge. Kamos and Merit moved like ghosts through the shadows of the limestone walls. The old caravan road twisted like a dying serpent, climbing higher into the western hills. Every sound, the skitter of a lizard, the groan of shifting rock, made them freeze. They knew that if a sledge convoy appeared in this narrow pass, there would be nowhere to hide. How much further? Merit asked, her voice a fragile thread in the wind. The moon is already starting to dip. If the sun finds us in this canyon, we'll be seen from the ridges. Kamos checked the stars once more. We are crossing the shoulder of Anubis. Just over that ridge is the descent into the Great Valley. If my memory of the old survey maps is correct, the secret path of the tomb builders starts there. As they reached the crest of the ridge, the world fell away. Below them lay the Valley of the Kings. It was a place of terrifying silence and sacred power, where the sun god Ra was said to begin his nightly journey into the Duat. Even in the dark, the white limestone of the cliffs glowed with an eerie, lunar light. They began the descent, their sandals sliding on the loose shale. This wasn't the tourist entrance to the valley. It was a steep, jagged goat path used by the Medjay of the necropolis. Unlike the palace guards, these men were desert dwellers, sworn by ancient oaths to protect the sleep of the pharaohs. They were the most elite, and most isolated, soldiers in Egypt. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic clack echoed through the canyon. It was the sound of a spear hitting a stone shield. "Halt!" A voice boomed, amplified by the natural acoustics of the rocks. "None walk the western hills after the sun has set." Identify yourselves, or your souls shall wander the sands forever." 3 men stepped out from behind a massive boulder. They were tall and lean, their skin scarred by the sun and their chests bare except for the crossed leather straps of their quivers. These were the true Medjay. They did not wear the gold-plated armor of the serpent's traitors. They carried simple, lethal bows of horn and wood. "I am Kamos, Chief Archivist of the Great Temple," Kamos shouted, holding up the bronze seal of his office. The metal caught the starlight. "I carry the word of the vizier. The throne is in peril." The leader of the scouts, a man with a grey-streaked beard named Inini, stepped forward. He looked at the seal, then at the 2 exhausted, ash-stained travelers. He didn't look impressed. "The Great Temple is many miles away, Scribe, and the vizier does not usually send children to the city of the dead with tales of peril." "Look at our skin, Inini," Merit said, stepping into the light. "The ash we wear is from the Eye of Uther. We have come from the south, through the Serpent's Forge. They have forged an army of gold and a breath of poison. They are coming for the festival." Inini's eyes narrowed. The mention of the Eye of Uther changed his expression from suspicion to grim curiosity. Only the desert-born knew of that place. He signaled to his men to lower their bows. "The wind has been strange lately," Inini admitted, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "The desert foxes have fled the lower canyons, and the birds do not sing at dawn. We thought it was a storm coming. If what you say is true, the storm has a face. It has the face of the high priest's brother," Kamos said, "and it is moving through the secret road behind your valley. They are bringing chariots. Inini, they intend to strike from the hills." Inini turned to his scouts. "Sound the low horn. Bring the captain of the valley. If the serpent thinks he can move through the land of the ancestors without being seen, he has forgotten who watches the dead." The low horn was not a sound of music, but a vibration that felt like a hum in the marrow of Kamos's bones. It was a signal designed to travel through stone, invisible to those on the open plains, but a clarion call to the Medjay hidden in the crevices of the valley. Within minutes, the small group was led deep into a hidden cavern behind the tomb of a forgotten queen. The air inside was cool and smelled of natron and dry earth. Torches flickered in bronze brackets, illuminating a large stone table covered in maps of the necropolis. Standing at the head of the table was Captain Becton, a woman whose presence was as sharp and unyielding as a flint knife. Her arms were corded with muscle, and her eyes held the weary wisdom of one who guarded the most sacred ground in the world. "Inini says you speak of gold-plated chariots and a blue plague," Becton said, her voice echoing in the chamber. She didn't look at Kamos. She looked at the bronze seal on the table. "I have seen the black-sailed ships from the heights. We thought they were smugglers. Why should I believe they are an army of the serpent? Because the gold they carry isn't for trade," Kamos said, stepping forward. He reached into his scroll case and pulled out the piece of twisted chariot nail he had found. "I found this on the old caravan road. It's reinforced with copper from the southern mines. And I saw the forge myself. Captain, I saw Senifer, the man you know as the Exile, wearing a silver mask and commanding thousands." Merit stepped up beside him. "The poison, the breath of Apep, is real. We saw it kill. They have hundreds of jars hidden in the hills. If they reach the city, the festival will become a funeral for all of Egypt." Becton picked up the twisted nail, turning it over in her hand. Her face remained a mask of iron, but a small muscle in her jaw jumped. "The old caravan road, it enters the valley through the Devil's Throat, a pass we haven't guarded in generations because it was thought to be impassable for vehicles. They have spent 20 years making it passable," Kamos countered. "They have cut into the rock, widened the ledges, and built sledges to carry the chariots. They aren't smugglers, Captain. They are an invasion." One of the younger scouts hissed. If they strike from the devil's throat, they come out behind the temple of Hatshepsut. They could reach the palace in less than an hour. The city guards won't even have time to string their bows. Bedtime slammed her hand onto the stone table. The Medjay of the valley do not fight in the streets. Our oath is to the ancestors. We protect the tombs. If the Pharaoh falls, the ancestors are forgotten. Kamos shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. Sennefer doesn't want to rule Egypt. He wants to erase it. He wants to bring back the chaos of the first time. If the city falls, your tombs will be looted, the names of the kings will be chiseled away, and the gods will turn their backs on the Nile. The chamber went silent. The torches hissed in the stillness. Bedtime looked at Kamos, then at her men. She saw the truth in the scribe's eyes. The kind of truth that only comes from staring into the abyss and refusing to blink. The festival of Opit begins at sunrise. Bedtime said finally, Inini, take 20 men to the devil's throat. Block the pass with whatever stone you can move. The rest of you, prepare the signal fires on the peaks. If the serpent moves, the whole of Thebes will see the mountain burn. She turned back to Kamos. You and the healer have done your part. But you cannot stay here. You must reach the palace. The vizier needs to know that the attack isn't coming from the river. It's coming from the sky. The descent from the western hills was a blur of jagged rock and silver moonlight. Captain Bedtime had provided them with 2 of her swiftest scouts and a pair of desert-bred donkeys. Sturdy, sure-footed beasts that moved with a relentless rhythm over the shale. Kamos felt every jar in his spine, his body screaming for the sleep he hadn't known in days. Beside him, Merit sat upright by sheer force of will, her knuckles white as she gripped the lead rope. The stars are fading, Merit whispered, glancing toward the eastern horizon. A thin, pale line of grey was beginning to eat away at the hem of the night. We're running out of time, Kamos. We'll make it, Kamos replied, though his voice sounded thin even to his own ears. The festival doesn't reach its peak until the sun is a hand's breadth above the horizon. We have to reach the vizier before the pharaoh boards the royal bark. As they reached the base of the cliffs, the cultivated fields of the west bank appeared. The air changed instantly, from the sterile, cold scent of the high desert to the rich, heavy smell of wet earth, flowering flax, and the distant smoke of cooking fires. Normally, this view was a comfort, a sign of home. Now, it felt like a target. They reached the river's edge just as the first light of dawn touched the tips of the great pylons across the water. Thebes was waking up. Thousands of people from the surrounding villages were already clogging the banks, dressed in their finest white linen, carrying garlands of lotus flowers and jars of beer. The sound of flutes and drums drifted across the Nile, a joyful noise that felt like a mockery of the horror Kamos knew was perched in the hills behind them. We can't take a ferry, the Medjay scout, Inini, muttered, his hand on his bow. The crowds are too thick. We'd be trapped in the middle of the river. There, Kamos pointed to a small, flat-bottomed fishing skiff tied to a sycamore tree. It was humble, smelling strongly of dried perch, but it was empty. It's not a royal galley, but it will get us across. They abandoned the donkeys and piled into the skiff. Kamos and the scouts grabbed the oars, pulling with a desperation that turned the water into white foam. As they neared the east bank, the scale of the festival became clear. The royal dock was a sea of gold and crimson. The pharaoh's bark, the User-Hetamun, was being prepared, its cedar hull gleaming with gold leaf. They scrambled onto the muddy bank, pushing through the throngs of revelers. The problem. Kamos was covered in grey ash and dried mud. He looked like a tomb robber, not the chief archivist. The obstacle. The palace guard had formed a solid wall of bronze shields around the entrance to the vizier's quarters. The clock. The high priests were already beginning the opening chant of the Opit ritual. Let us through. Kamos shouted, waving his bronze seal. A massive guard blocked his path, his spear leveled at Kamos's throat. "Back, beggar! This is the day of the king. No one approaches the inner court. I am the Chief Archivist." Kamos roared, his voice cracking. "Check the seal. If you don't move, the blood of every person in this square is on your hands." The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking to the bronze seal. In that moment of doubt, the first signal fire erupted on the peak of the western hills. A pillar of dark, orange flame shot into the sky. The Medjay signal. The serpent had begun its descent. The orange flame on the mountain peak acted like a lightning strike. The joyous music of the flutes wavered and died. A collective gasp rippled through the thousands gathered on the riverbank as every eye turned toward the western hills. The signal fire was not part of the ritual. It was an ancient omen of war. The seal! Kamos screamed at the guard, thrusting the bronze disc inches from the man's face. "The mountain is burning. Look!" The guard's discipline finally broke. He stepped aside, and Kamos and Merit bolted into the palace courtyard. They ran through the labyrinthine corridors, past startled servants and confused priests. They reached the vizier's private balcony just as Rekmire was adjusting his ceremonial leopard skin. "Vizier!" Kamos collapsed at the old man's feet, gasping for air. "The hills, the devil's throat, they are here." Rekmire didn't ask for explanations. He saw the ash on Kamos's face and the fire on the mountain. He turned to his herald. "Sound the call to walls. Now! And get the Pharaoh off the bark." But it was too late. From the high, jagged ridges behind the temple of Hatshepsut, a glint of gold caught the morning sun. Then another. And another. To the horrified spectators below, it looked as if the gods themselves were descending from the heavens. The gold-plated chariots of the serpent roared out of the hidden mountain passes, their wheels throwing up plumes of white limestone dust. They didn't come in a line, they came in a cascading wave, picking up speed as they hit the flat desert plateau leading toward the city. The sun hit the polished bronze and gold of their shields, creating a blinding, flickering light that paralyzed the city's defenders. "They aren't heading for the gates," Merit whispered, her hand over her mouth. "They're heading for the temple square." The strategy was brutal and brilliant. By coming from the hills, Sennefer had bypassed the river forts and the main city walls. The Opit festival had effectively gathered the entire leadership of Egypt into a single, unfortified open space. Kamos looked down at the square. The pharaoh's royal guard was trying to form a phalanx, but the crowds of panicked citizens were in the way, creating a chaotic sea of white linen. In the center of the square, a group of men in dark robes began to move. They weren't running away. They were pulling heavy clay jars from beneath the festival tables. "The poison!" Kamos shouted, pointing. "Vizier, they're going to release the breath in the middle of the crowd. Archers to the balconies!" Rekmire roared, but his voice was drowned out by the thunder of the approaching chariots. At the head of the chariot line was a vehicle of solid silver and ebony. Standing in it was a figure in a shimmering silver mask, holding a bow that seemed to be made of light. Sennefer had returned to Thebes, not as a brother or a priest, but as the herald of the end. "Merit, the vinegar." Kamos grabbed her medical bag. "We have to get to those jars before they break them. If the wind catches the smoke, it will flood the palace." They didn't wait for the guards. They scrambled down the back stairs of the balcony, heading straight into the heart of the panic. Kamos had spent his life recording history. Now, he was trying to prevent it from becoming a mass grave. The great square of Thebes had become a whirlpool of terror. The joyous music of the Opit festival was now a dissonant scream of thousands of people trying to flee through narrow alleys. Kamos and Merit fought against the current of the crowd, their shoulders bruising as they shoved past panicked revelers. The roar of the approaching chariots was like the sound of a collapsing mountain, a rhythmic, metallic thunder that shook the very stones beneath their feet. "There!" Merit shouted, pointing toward a massive stone offering table near the temple's northern pylon. 3 men in dark, serpent-scaled robes were huddling beneath the shadows of the pylon. They weren't fleeing. They were methodically lining up 10 heavy clay jars, their red wax seals glinting like blood in the morning sun. One man held a heavy bronze mallet, his eyes fixed on the charging chariot line. He was waiting for the signal, the moment the chariots broke the palace guard's line, to release the breath of Apep and choke the heart of the resistance. Kamos didn't think. He didn't have a spear or a shield, only the heavy bronze seal of the Chief Archivist gripped in his fist like a brass knuckle. He lunged at the man with the mallet, his momentum carrying him through the air. They crashed onto the stone pavement, the mallet skittering away across the square. Merit. The vinegar. Kamos grunted, pinning the cultist's arms down. Merit was already there. She didn't wait for a fight. She grabbed the first jar and dumped her entire flask of strong medicinal vinegar over the red wax. The acidic liquid hissed, reacting with the unstable seal. She then shoved the jar off the edge of the platform into a deep drainage trench filled with stagnant water. The water will slow the reaction. She cried out. The other 2 cultists snarled, drawing curved daggers. One lunged at Merit, but a blur of bronze intercepted him. It was the guard who had blocked Kamos earlier, the one who had finally believed him. He drove his spear through the cultist's chest, his face a mask of grim determination. Save the city, Scribe. The guard roared. I'll hold the pylon. But the distraction was enough for the 3rd cultist to reach for a dropped torch. With a cry of "For the serpent," he smashed one of the central jars against the base of the pylon. A hissing sound filled the air. A thick, roiling cloud of cobalt blue smoke began to pour from the shattered clay. It didn't rise, it stayed low, hugging the ground and spreading with terrifying speed. Cover your faces. Kamos yelled, pulling Merit back. They pressed their vinegar-soaked rags to their mouths, but the cloud was too large. The blue mist began to swirl around them. A nearby priest, caught in the edge of the cloud, clutched his throat and fell, his face turning a horrific shade of grey as he gasped for air that was no longer there. Suddenly, a massive shadow loomed over them. The silver chariot of Sennefer had reached the square, jumping the low marble barrier. Sennefer stood tall, his silver mask back in place, looking down at Kamos through the emerald eyes of the serpent. You are too late, little scribe. Sennefer's voice boomed through the mask. The breath is exhaled. The sun goes dark. He raised his bow, aiming a gold-tipped arrow directly at Kamos's heart. But as he pulled the string, the wind shifted. A sudden, powerful gust blew in from the river, a gift from the god Amun, or perhaps the sheer force of the Medjay's signal fires on the hills. The blue smoke, instead of flooding the palace, was pushed back toward the charging chariot line. Sennefer's horses reared in terror as the toxic mist enveloped them. The silver chariot swerved, the golden wheels skidding on the blood-slicked stones. The great square was a whirlpool of blue death and golden wreckage. The sudden northern gale, the breath of Amun, had turned Sennefer's masterpiece into his shroud. The toxic mist, designed to suffocate the palace, now clung to the silver chariot and the gold-plated scales of the mercenary horses. The beasts screamed, their lungs burning, and plunged blindly into one another. Sennefer stood in the center of the chaos, a ghost in a silver mask. He hacked and coughed, the emerald eyes of his mask clouded by the very vapor he had championed. He fumbled for his bow, but his fingers, slick with the blue residue, could not find the string. Kamos, his face still pressed into the vinegar-soaked linen, saw his moment. He didn't reach for a fallen spear. He reached for the one thing Sennefer truly feared: the truth. Near the offering table stood a massive, polished bronze ceremonial mirror, intended to reflect the sun into the temple's inner sanctum during the Opit ritual. It was a mirror of Marat, designed to symbolize the soul's clarity. Kamos grabbed the heavy frame and, with a strength born of pure desperation, tilted it toward the rising sun. A beam of concentrated, white-hot light lanced through the blue haze, hitting the silver mask of Sennefer directly in the eyes. "Look at yourself, Sennefer," Kamos roared through the cloth. "Look at the new world you built." Blinded by the reflection and choking on the mist, Sennefer recoiled. He ripped the silver mask from his face, gasping for air that wasn't poisoned. In the harsh, unfiltered light of the morning, he no longer looked like a god or a king. He looked like what he was, a broken, bitter man with a white star-shaped scar and eyes full of a 20-year-old rot. "The order is a lie." Sennefer wheezed, his voice no longer smooth silk, but a dry rattle. He reached for the side of his chariot, but his strength failed him. At that moment, the thunder of the chariots was replaced by a different sound, the rhythmic, terrifyingly steady beat of the Medjay's war drums. From the temple rooftops and the palace gates, Inini and Captain Becton's archers appeared. They didn't fire blindly into the crowd. They fired with the precision of the desert-born, picking off the serpent-masked mercenaries one by one. The cultists, seeing their god unmasked and gasping in his own poison, broke. They threw down their gold-plated weapons and fled toward the river, only to find the silver ibis and a fleet of palace galleys waiting for them. Merit rushed to the fallen priest near the pylon, pouring the last of her vinegar over a clean cloth and pressing it to his face. She looked up at Kamos, her eyes red and streaming from the fumes, but filled with a fierce, burning life. "He's alive, Kamos. The wind saved us." Kamos let go of the bronze mirror. It fell with a heavy, the light fading from Sennefer's face. The high priest's brother slumped against the side of his silver chariot, his hand twitching near the blue shards of the broken jars. He wasn't dead, but the breath of Apep had taken his voice and his vision. The shadow of the brother had finally been eclipsed by the sun. The blue mist did not linger. As the sun climbed higher, the desert wind swept the great square clean, carrying the last traces of the poison out over the Nile where it dissipated into nothingness. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant clatter of Medjay shields and the soft weeping of those who had nearly lost everything. The golden chariots, once symbols of a terrifying new era, lay overturned like discarded toys, their gold plating peeling away to reveal the cheap bronze beneath, a fitting metaphor for Sennefer's hollow dream. Sennefer was led away in silence. He did not look at the Pharaoh, nor did he look at the crowds. His eyes were fixed on the distant horizon, perhaps already seeing the sunless quarries of the south where he would spend the remainder of his days. The shadow of the brother had been cast out, and for the first time in 20 years, the House of the Hawk was free of its secret rot. A week later, the city of Thebes held a different kind of ceremony. There were no masks, no hidden poisons, and no secret agendas. The Pharaoh stood upon the dais of appearances, flanked by the royal vizier and Captain Becton. Below them, the people of Egypt gathered, not in fear, but in genuine gratitude. Kamos and Merit stood before the throne. They were no longer the dust-covered fugitives who had scrambled through the western hills. Kamos wore the fine linen of a chief archivist, a gold and lapis collar resting on his shoulders. Merit wore the simple, elegant white of a master healer of the House of Life. "You have done more than save a city," the Pharaoh said, his voice echoing through the silent courtyard. "You have saved the memory of our ancestors. A scribe knows that without the past, the future is a desert. A healer knows that without a heart, a body is but stone. You have given Egypt back its heart and its history." He gestured to the royal vizier, who stepped forward carrying 2 heavy golden chains, the gold of honor. It was the highest reward a pharaoh could bestow, usually reserved for generals who conquered nations. "Kamos of the House of Records," the vizier announced, "for seeing the truth when the world was blind. Merit of the House of Life," he continued, "for preserving the light when the shadows grew long." As the gold was placed around their necks, Kamos looked at Merit. She gave him a small, knowing smile. The same smile she had given him in the dark of the library when this journey had first begun. They had survived the breath of Apep, the quarry of the sun, and the madness of a forgotten brother. Months later, Kamos sat in the great library. The room was cool and smelled of cedar and fresh papyrus. Outside, the Nile was rising, the life-giving inundation beginning its yearly cycle. On his desk sat a small, black basalt statue of a cat, the same one that had started it all. He picked up a fresh reed pen and dipped it into the black inkwell. He didn't reach for a tax record or a temple inventory. Instead, he laid out a long, pristine roll of the finest papyrus. At the very top, in clear, elegant hieroglyphs, he wrote the title of his new work, The Chronicles of the Serpent and the Sun. "Are you still writing?" Merritt's voice drifted from the doorway. She was carrying a bundle of fresh lotus flowers for the library's altar. "I'm just finishing the introduction," Kamos said, looking up with a smile. "I want people to know that the most powerful thing in Egypt isn't a gold chariot or a silver mask." "Oh?" Merritt asked, leaning over his shoulder. "Then what is it?" Kamos pointed to the wet ink on the page. "It's the truth. Once it's written down, not even a god can erase it." He turned back to the page and began to write the story of a junior scribe, a healer, and the 3 days that changed the world. The ink was dark, the papyrus was strong, and for the first time in a long time, the records of Thebes were complete.